Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is story about what if Naruto Edo Tensei Highschool DxD Part 1. Before I start, please do support for more amazing content and comments for Part 2. Do consider to subscribe my channel and share my video to your friends and check out the description as well. Let's start the video. Shifting golden sand sought the horizon, with curving dunes hollowed out by the wind as the breeze uplifted clouds of blazing grit to be lit up by the evening sun. To an unbiased bystander, it was a sight that spoke of the majesty of nature and the inevitable breaking down of all things into the dust of creation. Naruto didn't even register it, his azure gaze sightlessly staring into the distant landscape of Kaze no Kuni. He was too caught up in thoughts of blood tribute, burnt souls, and resurrections to worry about something like aesthetic beauty. Naruto. The blonde turned, his grimace sending the whiskered birthmarks on his cheeks rippling with discontent. It was an uncommonly sour expression for the sunny young man, but given the events of the past hour it suited. Gray Scara circled perpetual Sharingan, the red of Sasuke's eyes seeming darker and less brilliant than Naruto was used to. It suited the Uchiha in a depressing way, considering the faint cracks visible on porcelain skin and the faint but ever-present scent of grave dirt. The sight only made Naruto even more bitter. How could they just do this? Why couldn't they just? Naruto trailed off, running a hand through his sunbright mane and scowling fiercely. I wanted to come back, yeah, but not like this. Sasuke finished, the exhale intensifying the smell of death. As a reincarnated summon, the Uchiha didn't strictly need to breathe. But the habits of the living were hard to break. What do you want to do? The implicit acknowledgement of authority actually made Naruto feel a bit better. Sakura and Gaara, who were aged and harder than he'd ever seen them, might have torn the two of them across worlds and out of the grave, but at least he had Sasuke at his back. I don't know. Do you think we'll be able to get back sometime, or are we stuck like this? Like this, meaning that they were a pair of travelers outside time, pulled back into a familiar place and an unfamiliar struggle, with one walking among the living and one striding with the dead. There were too many questions Naruto needed answers to, beginning with why they'd been resurrected by their teammate, and what the hell she'd been thinking. Why call them after so long? Why not sooner, if they were so desperate? Hard to say. It depends on Office, I suppose. Sasuke muttered, his bloodless lips drawing tight as he reflected on the Ouroboros dragon. The dragon god had brought them into the new world in the first place, and she seemed the one most able to pull them back out, but the last glimpse they'd had of her had been when she was bleeding and furious. Was Sakura so desperate she'd struggle with a god for the right to use them? A faint note of unusual concern entered Sasuke's usually neutral voice. There's nothing we can do about it now. Let's just go back in. Or did you need another minute? No. Naruto denied, an unusual hardness filling his voice. Let's go. Then the reborn Jinchuriki turned, stepping away from the desert sunlight and into the shadowed confines of the sub-baked hospital. The undead shinobi followed the living, their connection thrumming strong despite the gulf of mortality. One might move with blood and breath while the other was filled with cinders and soil, but they were united by a tie stronger than death, twin vessels born out of chakra and forbidden sacrifice. Office was ill-pleased. She had rather carefully selected Uzumaki Naruto and Uchiha Sasuke as candidates for rebirth, and in migrating their souls she decided to bind their spirits to her own. Sasuke had been bound even closer, to the point where his essence had started to run into her own and become dependent on her existence. So it was no shock that when those arrogant shinobi had managed to steal their souls back that it backlashed at her. The sudden frayed connections spanning universes had hurt, and raised up other questions. She'd regretted it when she was forced to feel the Uchiha boy's emotions, but that had just been inconvenient. If some lowly mortals could strike out at her and make her bleed through those children, then the connection wasn't simply troublesome. It was reckless and dangerous. Sasuke and Naruto had become liabilities, and there were only two ways to solve the problem they now presented. The first was to simply cut her losses and leave them out to dry, and the second was to bind them so tightly to her that no amount of human sacrifice and summoning could tear them away. Well, Rias Gremory began, arms folding over her chest with a single finger tapping anxiously at her elbow. That's a relief. However, that simply leads to more questions. If you're sustaining them here, then where did they go? And more importantly, how do you plan to get them back? Half-lidded gray eyes refocused on the impertinent mortal that seemed to have a death wish. The Gremory girl wasn't one of her soldiers, and she had nowhere near the power needed to survive anything more hefty than a backhand from Office. Her only point of value was her relation to Uzumaki Naruto and Uchiha Sasuke. A relation that she could, perhaps, make use of. They have returned to their universe of origin, summoned back by the shinobi to live in that world once more. The dragon god shrugged one black silk-clad shoulder. As for duration, it is uncertain. Even for one such as I, Transmigrating souls across realities is no simple thing. Doubly so if their souls have been bonded to that world rather than simply reborn in it. Flicking up a hushing finger to quiet Akino when the Thunder Priestess opened her mouth, Ophis never allowed her passionless gaze to waver. In the meantime, there is another problem you must attend to. At the best of speeds, the return of their souls will not be immediate. Yet Naruto Gremory is well known enough that he must be seen. His disappearance will not pass unremarked for long, so someone else must pretend to be him and give the image of health. Preferably you, Rias Gremory, because of your near blood relation. No one else would mimic his mannerisms and abilities as well. Truthfully speaking, Ophis did not care about the lives of the mortals crowded in the room. They were mere window dressing compared to the potential she'd seen in Uzumaki Naruto and Uchiha Sasuke. But regardless of her preferences, they had a common interest, so Ophis turned her mind to the situation at hand with unbounded eons of wily old cunning. If she needed to deal with these children, then the least she could do was make sure that without a doubt she owned them. A bright red eyebrow arched. And how do you suggest we do that? Illusion magic can only do so much, and considering the magical skill of the nobility at large that Naruto needs to be seen by, it would be discovered sooner or later. Rias was suspicious of the Ouroboros dragon. Ophis made too much of a habit of breezing in and out of their lives like a hurricane, caring nothing for the destruction she left behind. Why now was she suddenly deciding to be helpful? Ophis' gaze turned bright and cold, with the Lolita holding out a hand and gathering dark power in a flex of sorcery. Black scales shimmered like heavy oil under the sunlight, refracting into a faint rainbow of slick colors and shimmering patterns. Well, that is not such a difficult task. All I need you to do is open wide, girl. The air filled with the sibilant hissing of a great serpent. A faint crackle rumbled through his chest every time Sasuke made his undead body breathe in. It was barely noticeable compared to the horrifying color of his scara or the thin fissures that marred his clay face, but when he stood silently vigilant behind Naruto's shoulder, the Uchiha couldn't help but hear it. Breathe in. Fragile bone cracked as ribs shifted to accommodate the expansion of undead lungs, the shift of cartilage grinding gruesomely. Breathe out. Paper rustled as the jutsu that animated his dead body worked to heal the microfractures and restore him to the pristine peace of the grave. I want to know everything, and I mean everything. Naruto bit out, azure eyes blazing. There was a level of command in his voice that had been absent the first time he died, and its sudden appearance made Gaara and Sakura raise their eyebrows. Gaara's mismatched gaze, one eye teal green and the other the rippling violet of Sasuke's Rinnegan, flickered towards the dust-covered surface of the conference room table. Like much of the hospital, it was pitted with the marks of long use and had a dubious remaining lifespan. Have a seat. The Kazekage invited in a gravelly voice, syllables rasping as if he'd once had his vocal cords cut. Considering the dark ropey mass of scar tissue curving around the front of his neck, that probably wasn't so far from the truth. Without hesitation, Naruto grabbed hold of a rickety office chair, ignoring the squeaks as he wheeled the piece of cracked leather furniture about to plop down on. Maybe it was maturity, or perhaps it was simply the result of years of training as a Gehenna noble, but he had no urge to bounce around the room screaming like he would have in his first life. He was more contained than that. Sasuke chose to remain standing, undead flesh hard and tireless. He had no need to rest, and no desire to start exchanging pleasantries like it was a damn tea party. I don't want to beat around the bush, Naruto decided harshly, thinning his lips. Maybe if circumstances were different he'd have been glad to see his old friends again, but his plan to revisit Konoha had never included what was basically a heart attack followed by waking up in a new body again. It's obvious you guys decided to revive us. Why? Chewing one ragged thumbnail, Sakura examined her two resurrected teammates with a faint light of nostalgia in emerald green orbs. 17 years ago you both died, she prefaced quietly, pulling her thumb away from her teeth and settling her folded hands on the table. 5 years after that, Kumo and IWA declared the Fifth Shinobi World War. Sasuke blinked when Naruto jerked back in surprise. Was it really that odd? The Third Shinobi World War might have ended in a victory for Konoha against the combined force of IWA, Kumo, and Kiri. Relations with Kiri had eventually normalized, but Konoha's relationship with Kumo and IWA had always been contentious. Even temporarily allying for the war against Obito wouldn't have entirely soothed all tensions. If Konoha was going to fight anyone, those countries would be the most likely opponents. Gaara exhaled when it became obvious that Sakura had lost herself in her own train of memories. Settling a hand over the woman's pink locks, the grizzled Kazekage boldly offered Naruto a challenging stare. 2 years after that, Konoha was destroyed, leaving its people a scattered remnant that took refuge in Suna or Kiri. Since then we've been deadlocked in a constant war with the IWA Kumo alliance. That declaration hit Naruto like a mule's kick to the chest. Swallowing dryly, the blonde reached up to rub at his neck in an effort to force back the burn of bile. What the hell? He'd known it had to be bad or they wouldn't have resurrected him, but Konoha was just gone. Well, I fucking hope you brought us back here to fix all this shit. It was Kakashi's last decision as Rokudame Hokage to revive the two of you. Sakura sighed. We needed your strength, so we brought you back with the Edo Tensei. But we needed the real Naruto too, rather than just his power, so Sensei used the Rinnegan to fully revive him. My Rinnegan, Sasuke said coolly, studying with eye implanted in Gaara's left socket with a narrowed gaze. It might make him a hypocrite considering how he himself had basically pillaged Itachi's corpse to obtain a new set of eyes and stave off blindness, but their willingness to desecrate his body galled him. Sakura hesitated a brief moment before giving a sharp nod. That's right. She was well aware that Sasuke would have a negative opinion of her decision. She'd known that when she first extracted his eyes decades ago, but she still stood by that choice. It had been necessary for the good of Konoha. Demand sharpened Sasuke's voice until it seemed every word would draw blood. Where's the rest of my body then? Caution made Sakura's words slow and measured, with the war-weary expression on her weathered features deepening. She looked like she was 60 years old, rather than her true age of nearly 40. The rest of your body except for your eyes was destroyed a long time ago, on Kakashi's orders. We didn't want other countries playing pirate with your body for your power after you died. The left eye is as you see. She motioned vaguely towards Gaara. While the right eye became the genetic basis for your Edo Tensei summoning. Sasuke's first instinct was to offer up a blisteringly sarcastic reply. It was okay for Konoha to hoard his power for itself, but it was a crime if any of the other village wanted to do the same. It was just another prime example of the duplicity that had driven him to decide that revolution of the system was necessarily in his first life. But Sasuke's first instinct was only his old bitterness rising up, and he'd vowed years ago to try and leave the storm of rage and revenge behind him, so instead he bit through his unfeeling tongue and fell silent. At least they hadn't started pumping his corpse for sperm, or trying to graft his genetics into infants like the experiment Orochimaru had once conducted with Hashirama's cells. In the end, Sasuke had committed too many crimes for power in his day that he couldn't really point fingers at anyone else. Damn it, Sakura! Naruto finally exploded, raking a hand through his golden mane with his face twisted into a rictus of despair and fury. What the hell went wrong? We all came together to fight against Madara, and when it was all over we were comrades. The world I left behind was on the path to peace, not the road to genocide. The weakness of humanity to their own fear and hunger. Gaara murmured, folding his arms over his chest and seeming to age 100 years in a blink. When the village is committed to peace, we agreed to strive for a world without violence. Shinobi weren't going to be hired thieves and murderers anymore. But without those missions going into our pockets, the shinobi villages entered economic decline. Protection missions also dried up, as many shinobi were only employed as guardians against other shinobi. If we weren't killing, we didn't need to be guarded against after all. Some found employment in other fields of work, but for many trying to adapt was too hard. Sakura tilted her head in agreement. Shinobi were trained to be warriors and spies, not farmers or glassblowers. It was the only lifestyle they knew, and when things got tough they fell back on it. We started taking on assassination and espionage missions again, and the economy improved. The ideal of peace was forgotten when it was war that put food on the table, and with you and Sasuke dead everyone suddenly remembered how weak Konoha actually was. The Kyuubi did us no favors, Orochimaru just compounded the issue, and pain nearly destroyed us. A bitter chuckle burst from Sasuke's mouth, the Uchiha shaking his head ruefully with a rustle of long dark hair. Naruto and I fought that last time to decide the future, and in the end we agreed to move forward with the idea that peace could be built on bonds and mutual understanding. But everyone only agreed to peace out of fear of our power. That's... The slap of Naruto's palm on the tabletop was deafening, cutting off Sasuke's rumination with an echoing clap. No, the Jinchuriki decided, lurching to his feet with a flash of blue fire in his eyes. I'm not going to accept that. We weren't wrong the first time, Sasuke. Peace though understanding is possible. A curled fist thumped against Naruto's thigh as the blonde glowered in frustration. I didn't want to be reborn this way, but I'm here now, and I'm going to figure out what went wrong and fix it. That's my promise for this lifetime, and I never go back on my word. The pinched look on Sakura's face relaxed into gentle nostalgia and exasperated fondness. That's the knucklehead I remember. Sasuke. Turning on the spot, the Uzumaki fixed a sharp stare on his undead friend. There was no frivolity pulling at his whiskered cheeks or humor gleaming in his gaze. The only thing that could be found was burning resolve and diamond determination. It was the gaze of the king. Will you help me? And there he was, Sasuke realized. Naruto's second life had taught him to be polished like a son of the nobility, but it had also stolen the magnetic gravitas that had enabled the blonde orphan to change the world. Perhaps it was being in his old body that did it, or possibly it was finally taking up a goal he cared passionately for, but that certain spark was back. A smile curved gray dirt lips. Moron, do you even have to ask? Sasuke would be standing there next to him, right to the very end. Naruto wrapped his worn tan headscarf tighter around his face, covering everything up to the eyes in an effort to keep the blowing sand of the desert out of his mouth. Sweat stung the corner of his vision, brought out by the blaze of the sun despite the late hour of the day. I still think you should have just used tail beast mode. Scurrying around like rats is beneath us. Settle down, Kurama? The blonde muttered, bracing his knees when a strong gust of wind pulled at their traveling party. This way is smarter, and you know it. TCH. When he'd been a kid, Naruto never would have let himself travel anywhere so covered up. Everything he did had been about getting noticed. But he was much older and wiser now. They had to stay below the radar if they didn't want his and Sasuke's return to be blabbed about from one end of the continent to the other. Secrecy was important, so he hadn't kicked up a fuss about taking the longer route to Sunagakure. If they were discovered before they'd had a chance to come up with a good plan, there was no telling how the other villages would react. 20 years dead had probably dented his reputation, so the younger generation of ninja from Kumo or IWA might think his story was just a bunch of puffed-up bullshit and do nothing about it. Or they could panic and escalate from the current stalemate into total war. In the end, they had to play their cards right to prevent more death. Naruto wasn't dumb or selfish enough to value pride over human lives. Sakura. The blonde coughed when the wind finally died down, falling into step beside his aged squadmate. What happened to everyone else? You and Gaara are right here obviously, and Kaka-sensei. Naruto trailed off, biting the inside of his cheek until he drew blood. Damn his stubborn old teacher. He would have been fine just being an Edo-tensei summon like Sasuke, so there was no reason for Kakashi to just go and die like that. But Kakashi had always gone the extra mile for his team. It was part of what Naruto admired about his first sensei. Glittering emerald orbs shifted from the distant sand dunes to peer at the reborn Jinchuriki. Sakura blinked the grit from her eyes, barely feeling the pain after her years of get used to the arid climb. It was nothing compared to the agony in her chest. Hinata committed suicide a few months after we found you dead. Tenten and Sai died during the invasion that destroyed Konoha. The rest of us made it out, but not in one piece. Kiba lost his legs and Lee's blind. Each name was like a fresh dagger to Naruto's already aching heart. He never wanted to die, but knowing just how badly his absence had affected his friends and his village made him wish more desperately than ever before that he hadn't. If he hadn't let himself go that one night at the bar all those years ago, so many things would be different. What else? Shikamaru and Temari got married half a year after you died, but they got divorced a couple of years ago and he's with Ino now. Chuji and Kankuro have an understanding. Shino turned into a bit of a playboy, but everyone knows he's the father of Kurenai-sensei's second kid. Sakura rattled off in a crisp tone. Gaara and I married for politics, right after the exile. Naruto was glad for the tidbits of gossip that helped distract him from thinking about how so many of his friends were dead or crippled. Kurenai-sensei and Shino? He shuddered dramatically. What about Taka? Sasuke spoke up for the first time in hours, his uncovered hair rustling in the breeze. Unlike the rest of their small party, the undead warrior made no concession to the heat and breeze he couldn't feel. And Orochimaru? The Uchiha asking after his old team and sensei wasn't entirely unexpected, but the quiet scoff that Sakura gave off let Naruto know that even after all these years the pink-haired woman was still holding a bit of a grudge. She blamed them, and Orochimaru especially, for leading Sasuke away from Team 7. Naruto himself had forgiven Orochimaru a long time ago, but that didn't mean he liked the man either. A creep was still a creep, no matter which team he was playing for. Suigetsu went back to Kiri and reformed the Seven Swordsmen. He's now ranked pretty high in their government, and is one of our closest allies. Jugo died when Kumo rolled right over Oto at the start of the war. Orochimaru was taken prisoner by IWA, but our spies say he's still not talking. Kabuto is one of our most skilled Irinin, in case you were wondering. The absence of a particular name stuck out. And Karen? Sasuke prodded, his voice colored by only a cool sort of disinterest. If Naruto hadn't known already, he never would have guessed his friend had taken his distant relative as a lover once upon a time. It made him question just how much emotion there actually had been in that affair. Sakura's eyes crinkled with an anguish and pity. Karen was captured by Kumo during the fall of Konoha. They took her back to their village and put her in one of their bloodline breeding programs. When she got pregnant, she sabotaged the electric system of the house they were keeping her in. In the end, she burned herself to death. It kept them from using any of her DNA after she passed on. I see. Sasuke sighed raggedly, running a hand over the back of his head in a stress-relieving gesture. There was no reaction to the death and imprisonment of several of his old comrades beyond that, and Naruto wondered if it was because Sasuke was simply used to people he'd formed bonds with dying brutally. The thought was profoundly sad. We're almost there. Gaara cut in, tossing a look over his shoulder as he interrupted the depressing conversation. Keep those scarves up, and that includes you, Sasuke. Even 20 years later you're still recognizable, and we don't need word about you two getting out quite yet. Clicking his tongue at the Kazekage's order, Sasuke pulled the balled-up headscarf from his pocket and swiftly wrapped its concealing folds around his hair and face. Let's just get this over with. Rias woke with a bitter aftertaste in her mouth and a heavy throbbing ache between her eyes. Good, you're awake. Akino's exhausted voice greeted her, and a soft, warm hand slithered underneath Rias' shoulders to help the redhead into a sitting position. Wincing at the stiff pull of muscles in her neck, Rias turned her attention to her queen and stopped short in shock. Akino looked awful, with heavy dark bags beneath her eyes and thick bloodshot lines all through her white scara. The skin of her face was grayed with bone-deep fatigue, and even more concerningly her pink lips had tinged to an unhealthy blue. What happened? Rias demanded in dismay. How long was I out? Blinking in confusion, Akino tilted her head. Only a few hours, why? A few hours? The disbelief was thick in Rias' strident tones. But you look like she trailed off, not quite sure how to say it without sounding outright insulting. But it seemed like her hesitation was for naught, as Akino suddenly just looked very amused. Like death warmed over? Akino chuckled roughly, stepping back away from the bed to give her mistress more space. That's so cruel of you to say, Rias-tan. Rias snorted at the teasing, relieved that at least that was the same, and rolling to her feet in a single smooth motion. Patting at her tangled mane in an attempt to restore some order to the mussed strands, she smirked. If you have enough energy to act the fool, then you'll be all right. Now, what happened with Ophis? Pouting just a bit, Akino waved her hand about airily. After she fed us our reptile supplement, she said she would be in touch, and then she went kapoof. Rias frowned at that. What do you mean us? A niggling suspicion burbled up in her gut, and Rias hoped she was wrong. She had decided to take on the risk of venom alone, and she hadn't wanted the rest of her peerage to come gambling along with her. It was stupid and unnecessary. Scratching the side of her nose sheepishly, Akino let her violet gaze track off to the side to avoid meeting the redhead's piercing teal stare. Well, once you had the snake stuffed down your throat, Yudo raised a good point. You and Naruto are practically brother and sister, and it would be strange if you weren't seen together. So if you're pretending to be Naruto, then someone has to pretend to be you, and we all agreed that I was the best choice. And then Ophis made it happen. Idiots, all of you! Rias exploded, clapping a hand to her forehead and giving an exasperated groan. The ruined princess had no words to describe just how thoughtless they were rushing ahead like that without even asking for her opinion. Soul-binding magic was complex and dangerous. It was bad enough that one of their little family had to take the risk of switching between bodies to keep Naruto's absence and past life a secret, but playing a game of musical chairs with possession was just asking for trouble. You're being too reckless. Akino gave her best friend a chilly glare. And who exactly decided you're the only one that is allowed to take risks, Rias? Because the last time I checked, we were all treating each other as equals. You and Naruto might be nobility by birth, but we're your friends, not your slaves. And if we want to stick our necks out for you, we will. That's what love is about in the first place. The rebuke came like a slap to the face, driving Rias to recoil with a jaw clenched in indignation. Maybe it wasn't some rule they'd explicitly laid out, but the redhead thought it was pretty clearly implied. The older members of her peerage took care of the younger ones, and the strong defended the weak. Rias was the second oldest and the strongest in their little family, with the protection and resources of the nobility on top of it. Out of all of them, she was the most qualified to take risks and make decisions. For anyone that wasn't Sasuke to step up and throw themselves in danger alongside her without so much as a by your leave felt bizarre and disorienting. Then again, maybe she should have expected it. Having lost her family once and spending years on the run made Akino even more reckless than Rias herself could be. A few years of stability wouldn't tame the underlying insecurity. So rather than throw down the gauntlet over Akino's choice, Rias just screwed on a blandly polite smile instead. Well, I suppose it's too late to do anything about it now. If she couldn't change things, Rias would just work with them as they were. She was good at that. The moon was high in the sky, hanging fat and pale like a swollen melon by the time they slipped into the back streets of Sunagakure. More than one patrolling guard had flitted by overhead to inspect their party, but they always cleared out once Gaara made a wiggling motion with his left hand. Naruto couldn't help but find it amusing. Secret handshakes and code words? Maybe the whole Kage game was much less serious than he'd always thought it was, and much more like a bunch of kids playing in their secret base. The Konoha Corps would have pissed themselves with glee back in the day if they knew. I don't think you're one to talk. All you ever did was whine on and on about being the Hokage. Shut it, furball. Knuckling the sand out of one eye, Naruto dogged Sakura's footsteps as she led him to one of the many squat homesteads that populated Suna. It looked exactly like the dozen houses they'd already passed, and if not for the swelling sensation of chakra at the edge of his still rusty senses, Naruto wouldn't have thought it was any different from the rest. Sakura coughed dryly, knocking on the door twice, then 5 times, then once, and then finally 8 times. Hurry it up, Kazui-kun. She harangued in a rolling tone better suited to a peasant fishwife than the Nanadame Hokage. The dango is getting cold. Troublesome bitch. A baritone voice rumbled from the other side of the door, vaguely familiar and accompanied by the sound of a lock clicking open. I knew I should have told your parents to piss off with the whole marriage idea. Oh sure, I'm the problem. Sakura snapped as the door cracked open, turning to usher in her followers without missing a beat in her contrived ranting. It's not that you smoke too much or that you drink too much, oh no. It's all me. Naruto slipped through the thin opening, squinting his eyes as they were plunged into complete darkness. The only thing he could see was Sasuke's faintly burning Sharingan hovering in pitch black. And then with the stink of burning pitch orange light flared. About time you got here. Shikamaru muttered, angry red scars curving across the planes of his face as he harshly studied the 2 resurrected shinobi. I expected you 3 hours ago. There were complications with the Edo Tensei. Gaara replied frostily, shucking off his cloak before squarely meeting his ex-brother-in-law's dark eyes. We needed more sacrifices to bind their souls than we expected, and ended up burning through every volunteer before we managed to take hold of them. TCH. The Nara grunted, holding his torch aloft to better considering Naruto's lively flush and the gray pallor of Sasuke's undead flesh. Well, at least it was worth it. Sacrifices? Naruto questioned lowly, with a particular edge to his words that only came from slow-building fury. Both he and Sasuke were intimately aware of what price had to be paid to use Edo Tensei or Rinna Tensei, at least 1 life for each jutsu. But Gaara's words fairly clearly suggested they needed more than that. How many people, exactly, died to bring us back here? 100 each. Sakura broke in clinically, flicking the lock shut with callous fingers before grabbing the torch from Shikamaru's lazy grip and plodding through the hallways of the empty home. Left with no choice but to follow if he was going to get answers, Naruto clenched his jaw and stomped after the pink-haired woman. More and more the blonde was questioning what the fuck had happened to everyone. He died and had faith that his friends would at least be able to carry on his dream. Instead he came back to discover they were all dabbling in murder and human sacrifice. They descended a vast spiraling staircase, tunneling deep into the earth until all sounds of the world above had faded away and the only sound was Naruto's thrumming pulse in his ears. Hey, are we almost there? He prodded, breaking the silence with a huff. Almost. Gaara answered, abruptly turning in place and feeling along the bricked walls of the stairwell. Nimble fingers slid into recessed caches, and the redhead shoved forward, pushing a hidden door inward on its hinges. Coughing at the stale air, Naruto waved the dust away and moved into a great chamber bathed in golden light and filled with the scent of wax candles. Yo, Naruto. A grin split the Jinchuriki's lips, and for the first time in hours he felt something like steady ground underneath his feet. What's up, dog breath? He shot back, a teasing twinkle in his eye as he set his gaze on Kiba. The Inuzuka clan head had let himself go in the decades since they'd last seen each other. What used to be a tightly muscled abdomen had grown into a meaty belly, pushing against the rough-spun cotton of Kiba's tunic and jiggling when the man patted at his great stomach. Really, the only thing that was the same was the shaggy hair and the thick red tattoos marking his flabby face. Just waiting for you to lounge your wussy ass in here, fox boy. Naruto refused to look away from the stumps of Kiba's legs, rounded at the knee and covered up with rolls of cloth and blankets. It would demean his old bar buddy if he started treating the man like a freak show cripple. So even if it made his heart ache in his chest, Naruto was determined not to react to it. Well, better late than never, any? The fanged grin on Kiba's face twisted. Yeah, he replied, a brittle sound to his booming voice. So, who all else is here? Naruto questioned with a practiced smirk, azure gaze shifting from one face to the next. Shino he had expected, and Chuji's stern face, but the heavily pregnant Ino was a bit of a shock. Fuck, you look like you're about to pop. Sakura slapped the blonde across the back of the head, near 2 decades later but with all the familiar reflex of yesterday. Naruto. The Hokage groaned, shaking out her hand and glaring half-heartedly at her wincing squadmate. Barking a sharp laugh, Ino cradled a protective hand over her belly and eyed Naruto with an expression of nostalgic fondness. I see you haven't changed, she mused, cocking a pale eyebrow when Sasuke huffed. And neither did you, Sasuke-kun. The smile Naruto offered the hodgepodge collection of his old friends was only a little strained. Sure, there seemed to be too many faces missing. And sure, the ones that were there were all marred by war scars and old despair, but they were still his old comrades. If he turned away from them now just because they'd had a few tragedies or because they were a little weathered, he couldn't claim to be Uzumaki Naruto. So, what's the plan? Inhaling a lungful of smoke, Shikamaru pursed his lips around the stub of his cigarette and bent over the pitted table that Sakura had spread a yellowed map over. We're thinking that we can smash their lines here and here. The Nara traced curving lines that advanced from Suna's hinterland, deep into the land of fire. We want to move fast and hard, and reoccupy Konoha by the 3rd day. At that point, the element of surprise will be gone. Naruto studied the shaded areas of the map representing lost territory with a frown. Objectively, he'd know it had to be bad, but it was different when he actually could see how much of his homeland had been lost. Only a shallow crescent along the southern shoreline between Kaze no Kuni and Mizu no Kuni was still in the hands of Konoha. Sasuke and I should split up then, Naruto decided, glancing at the Uchiha for any traces of disagreement. I don't want to toot my own horn or anything, but I'm pretty sure they don't have anyone hanging around that could take either one of us. So it'll move faster if we each take a half. TCH, fine. Sasuke grunted, folding his arms over his chest with a faint creak of splitting gray dirt flesh. The sound brought a disgusted grimace to Kiba's face, and the shaggy-haired man made a quiet attempt to wheel away. Shikamaru blinked in bemusement. That's what I would have suggested, he demurred. Maybe 20 years had passed and made his memory a bit foggy, but he was pretty sure that the Naruto who died hadn't even been that tactically aware. Did the Jinchuriki mature in the afterlife, or was there some other factor at play transforming him from a living wrecking ball to a somewhat competent strategist? Look, Naruto huffed, stepping closer to the table and gently nudging Sakura out of the way. If we follow the road system, we're going to run into a few choke points. Nothing we can't handle. He reassured the room at large without removing his sharp gaze from the yellowed map. But you might want to take the time to really occupy them so you can use them as supply lines to Konoha. It would stretch it out to 4 days, but we'd be better off. I agree, Sasuke offered, speaking up to contribute for the first time since the discussion began. Compared to Naruto, he was much less enthusiastic about getting involved with the reconquest of Konoha, and it showed in his silence. You don't have a guarantee on how long the war will run, and they have significantly more resources than you do. Give them time to retreat and fortify your lines. If you try to force them into battles of annihilation, you'll make them desperate and run up the casualties on both sides. Holding his palm up to forestall any further debate, Gaara offered his support. We'll go with Naruto's plan. Our alliance doesn't have the numbers theirs does, and because we've kept Naruto's return and this invasion a secret, we won't have reinforcements from our allies. We don't have the manpower to sustain heavy losses, so we need to focus on preserving our armies while achieving strategic objectives. So there's no reason to go crazy about it and try to kill as many people as possible, Naruto mumbled, shrugging off the sharp look his comment drew from Sakura. He didn't give a damn if it was an unpopular opinion. Naruto understood the hunger for vengeance that his friends had, but that didn't mean he was going to support it. Sasuke had caused enough trouble with that particular urge the first time, and he had only been one guy. An entire village craze for revenge would be an utter clusterfuck. The only way to build peace in the long run was to break the chain of hatred and step forward into the future together. There was no point to taking back Konoha if it just led to more conflict and more killing. They needed open dialogue and a new system that would deal with the problems they'd had the first time they tried to build a world without war. Thankfully, he had come up with a plan as soon as Sakura started talking about invasions. Taking back their homeland would be enough to show the world that he was really back and that the Southern Alliance had some actual bite. At that point, Naruto just needed to get everyone around the table to hash out the peace details. It would be easy enough to get started, even if all the treaty haggling and paper pushing would make him want to dig his own eyes out with rusty spoons. If there was one thing about Naruto that Sasuke had learned over the years, it was that his friend never knew when to quit and take a breather. The indomitable fire in the belly that Naruto possessed had led the man to some of his greatest victories, but it also made him neglect his own well-being when the pressure mounted. So when Naruto's hands started faintly trembling, Sasuke knew he had to step in before the blonde ran himself into the ground. Stop wasting time, the Uchiha declared, shifting his dim red gaze from one tired shinobi to the next. Exhaustion stamped itself into their faces with wrinkles and dark bags, the hours-long discussion taking its toll after having continued through the night and into the early morning. You've already decided on your deployments. Now you're just talking in circles. Sakura clicked her tongue irritably, setting one hand on her hip as she glared at her ex-squadmate. The lack of slavish adoration in her eyes still shocked Sasuke from time to time, but he supposed that 2 decades of warfare would change even that. Fine. Everyone head home and get some rest. We'll be moving at the end of the week. Until then, no one say anything about Naruto or Sasuke. If word gets out, it'll be catastrophic for our plans. A chorus of agreements escaped the crowd as they shuffled away in a fatigued mass, leaving the resurrected shinobi alone with the 2 Kage. We need to get back to the office as well, Gaara explained, mismatched gaze soft and wistful as he spoke to Naruto. We'd like it if you two remained here. I understand the accommodations aren't ideal, but as Sakura said, we can't afford to have word of your presence getting out quite yet. Until then, Shikamaru will look after you. There are a couple of spare rooms here for you to use. Glancing towards the short hallway tunneled into the back corner of the conference room, Naruto gave an exasperated sigh and nodded. Fine. You gotta do what you gotta do. He didn't want to spend the next few days hiding in what was basically a cave, but it seemed he didn't have much of a choice. After exchanging goodbyes with the blonde and the taciturn Uchiha, the 2 Kages departed, leaving them alone for the first time in nearly 20 hours. Naruto made it half a minute before exhaling all his breath in a ragged whoosh, sagging down and steadying himself against the nicked round table. What the fuck? He cursed as anger mingled with despair. I knew it was bad after they gave us the rundown, but to actually see them. All the emotions in Naruto's chest tangled up into a wretched ball that seemed to stick in his throat, choking out every breath he tried to take and making his head swim. Near 2 decades in another world had dulled the pain of losing all his bonds and the life he'd built for himself. With difficulty, Naruto had come to terms with it all. A quick peek at a happy and safe Konoha was all he would have asked for, and he'd have been able to close the cover on his old life entirely. Instead, Naruto woke up and was forced to come face to face with the living ashes of his dreams, seeing the devastation marked in scars and the conspicuous absence of deceased comrades. He was surrounded by familiar strangers, and could only hope that if he managed to do it right this time that he'd feel less like an interloper and more like he'd actually come home. Uzumaki Naruto. Jerking violently as he was torn from his spiraling thoughts, Naruto flipped the table and turned on the spot with a livid expression. Don't do that. Fuck, what's wrong with you? Ophice blinked, tilting her head at the worn-out Jinchuriki before glancing at Sasuke's amused smirk. I felt speaking to you directly as soon as your human compatriots departed was ideal, since there is no need for them to know about me. Do you disagree? Now I just know that you're pulling my leg. Naruto grumbled, shoving aside all the memories of Kiba's broken body and Lee's broken mind to focus solely on the Ouroboros dragon. As long as he had something else to fixate on, he didn't need to think about how his fingers were shaking in his pockets, or the nauseous burn in his throat. But fine, what's happening over there? Frowning at the mortal's demanding tone, Ophice primly dusted off her shoulder before settling her glittering gray stare on the whiskers adorning Naruto's cheeks. I have contracted Rias Gremory to possess your body and act as a suitable substitute for you during your stay here. When you return, your position in society will be undisturbed. The circumstances are not ideal, but I will facilitate your travels regardless, as per our agreement. Possession is a dangerous spell, Sasuke pointed out with a thin veneer of mildness over aggression. One word might be enough to move him to violence, or soothe his protective temper. I will sustain her existence the same way I've sustained yours. Leaving Sasuke to mull over that bland reassurance, Ophice directed her next words at Naruto. Since I suspect you would prefer to handle the situation here without my interference, I will leave it in your hands. Expect my return with a method of communication in the coming days. And then Ophice vanished in a puff of oily mist. Bitch. Naruto muttered, running a hand through his hair and exhaling irritably. I'm starting to get real fucking pissed off at the way everyone seems to want to yank our chains lately. Do this, do that, remember this, bah. Quirking one eyebrow up as Naruto began to work himself into a spitting fury, Sasuke reached out and flicked the whiskered blonde on the ear. Go to bed, moron. You're not achieving anything getting all worked up. He'd remain on guard out in the meeting room, needing neither food nor rest to sustain his undead flesh. You're going to be the next one on my shit list if you keep that up. Naruto is going to be a problem. Rolling up the latest report on the economic decline of Suna with calloused hands, Gaara threw it aside and rolled over to face his wife. Perhaps. The Kazekage allowed, fingering idly at the threadbare futon beneath them. He's slightly different, but death kept him young. Hopefully experiencing more of the real world will cure him of his idealism. Decades ago, labeling Naruto a mere idealist would have been outright heresy for Gaara, who had worshipped his fellow Jinchuriki like that blonde was his own personal prophet. But years of war had made him hard and bitter, and the eyes that he looked out at the world with were jaded. He'd make allowances for nostalgia, but that would only make him bend so far to accommodate Naruto. Sakura snorted, sprawling on her back and settling her hands behind her head. I wouldn't hold out a lot of hope for that. I grew up with him and I remember just how stupidly stubborn he is. He chased after Sasuke for years, not to mention how he basically forced people to acknowledge him rather than the fox. We admired it back then, but now it could get pretty damn inconvenient. I don't think anything is going to make him wake up to how the world really works. Then put it out of your mind, Gaara suggested, letting his eyes flutter shut as he struggled to relax and find a few hours of sleep. Even if he disagrees with us, it's not in his nature to betray us and side with our enemies. At worst, we'll take back Konoha and then he'll unintentionally intimidate everyone into a watchful peace. We can rebuild without fear of invasion as long as he's alive, and if you don't name him your successor or pick a new Hokage that would abdicate to him, we can keep him isolated from the levers of power. He's a dreamer, not a builder, so he'll never be a serious opponent during peacetime politics. Fair enough. Sakura mumbled back, not entirely appeased but willing to drop it for now and let her husband get to sleep. Rationally, she knew Gaara was right. If Naruto was truly so clever and manipulative, he would have been the Rokudaime rather than Kakashi. Age wasn't a true impediment for charismatic visionaries, as the Sandaime and Yondaime had proven, and a crafty Naruto could have leaned on his war hero status to take the hat. But Sakura couldn't quite shake the feeling that Naruto was not the same boy she'd buried all those years ago. The Naruto she'd just finished a meeting with was softer spoken, visibly watchful, and displayed a strategic insight she'd never seen in the old Naruto. Some might dismiss her feelings as paranoia, but Sakura had learned the hard way that it was paranoia that truly kept a shinobi alive. If Konoha had been more suspicious of her so-called allies, they wouldn't have all been caught with their pants down by the declaration of war. So maybe it was just her hardwired anxiety talking, but no matter what happened, Sakura would be ready. If Naruto listened and learned from their experiences, then that was fine. And if he didn't, then she'd do whatever had to be done for the sake of Konoha. Shifting into Naruto's body felt all kinds of wrong. When Rias had first began feeding her energy into the ensorcelled black gemstone pendant Ophis had given her, she'd expected a bit of disorientation as her mind traveled between bodies. A dizzy spell, a bit of darkness, and then she'd open her eyes having completed the shift. Instead, she felt like she was falling, sinking through thick black oil that choked out every bubble of air from her lungs. And in the last moment, when Rias was sure she'd break from the combination of pain and fear, she passed through to the other side and jolted into awareness. Sucking in a gasp, Rias opened her eyes. The sight of her own body slumped over in a fluffy scarlet armchair greeted her, pallor coloring aristocratic cheekbones and unhealthy gray and darkening pink lips to a sickly blue. Akino. Rias rasped, flinching at the pain sting that Naruto's vocal cords gave. Several days without use had stiffened up all the muscles in his body, and a little pain was to be expected. She wasn't disturbed by the masculine timbre that accompanied her words. She wasn't. You're back with us? Cloth rustled as Akino strode into Rias' line of vision and settled a hand on one skirt-clad hip. Does it all seem to be in working order? No shakiness or numbness? Heaving Naruto's body to its feet, Rias rolled her shoulders and stretched out the kinks. No, she decided, cracking fingers that felt just a little too thick and calloused. Everything is stiff, but that's just to be expected after laying around for a few days with no activity. I don't feel like my control itself is subpar. As the words rolled off Naruto's tongue, Rias found the movements of her lips growing less stilted with every syllable. Even with a new metaphorical driver, the muscles of her nephew's body had their own memory. Giving herself over to instinct made everything easier, but it increased the disturbing feeling that she wasn't truly in control of herself. Irrationally, it reminded Rias of the horror stories she'd read where the protagonist ended up a prisoner in their own body. That's good. Akino made a face, calling into question just how sincere that sentiment really was. Sure, possession was nothing more or less than what they'd agreed to. But soul magic was taboo for a reason, and knowing there was someone else behind Naruto's azure eyes probably gave the Thunder Priestess visceral chills. Well, there's no time to waste then. You and Ravel are going to be practicing a mock dinner in an hour, so you should get ready. I'll hide your body with Sasuke's. Tousling crimson strands that felt distressingly short, Rias grimaced. It wasn't that she disliked Ravel by any means, but playing the blonde's lover was quite a few steps out of her comfort zone. Playing Akino's lover on her own time was difficult enough, even if it had become shockingly easy once the initial hump was crossed. Adding another layer of emotional deception would be draining. Alright, but first I want to try something. Rias turned inward, brushing aside the dark siren call of the gemstone necklace around Naruto's neck that was paired with her own. As comforting as returning to her own body would be, she couldn't afford to be weak now. She'd already agreed to walk down this path, and she intended to see it through to the end. Seizing control of the flowing red energy that seethed through Naruto's every cell, Rias pulled and shaped. Enchantment surged forth, bucking against an unfamiliar master and searing with raw heat. There was so much power that rose up at her command, and Rias couldn't help but marvel at just how strong her nephew had become. And then the ruined princess let go, sparking red lightning from the tips of blunted fingernails that crackled into the small forks of a handheld electric storm. Blood and ashes, it hurt. The pain was so sudden and sharp that Rias couldn't help but wonder why Naruto's body seemed unharmed. Of course, it was his magic, and forcing it to answer to her would never come without cost. But despite the psychic pain, Rias could command it, and for the sake of their ruse, that was all she needed. After 3 days of living in what was little more than a well-lit cave, Naruto was starting to get just a little prickly. Conversation with Sasuke had gotten stilted after the first day, since either of them felt like it would be a great idea to start talking about their life in Gehenna while surrounded by shinobi. It was like there was an invisible line dividing one world from the other, and neither wanted to cross it. Or maybe they just didn't want to face the judgment that would probably be in their comrades' eyes when everyone realized that while the shinobi had been fighting and dying, Naruto and Sasuke had been living it up. Things in hell had been pretty damned luxurious, and they made no real efforts to find a way back home. Sighing explosively, Naruto pressed his face closer into the thin mattress of his rusted cot and shoved those heavy thoughts away. It was better that he dwelled on something more mundane, like that fact that he was bored out of his mind. At the least, he'd hoped that his old friends would take advantage of the time before the storm to drop by and catch up, but the only person he'd seen besides Sasuke was Shikamaru. And while the strategist would answer Naruto's questions, it wasn't the same as speaking to the actual people he once called nakama. Stop whining. It's annoying, Sasuke demanded coolly, his dim red gaze shifting away from counting the cracks in the ceiling to stare at Naruto's prone form. There was no heat in his words, just a steel-edged sort of resignation. It was like all the passion had been drained out of Sasuke, leaving only an unbending need to succeed and a willingness to endure beyond human limits. Naruto had an inkling that was how Uchiha had dealt with the endless tension on the front lines of the war with Michelin, and wondered if he'd turn out to be just as jaded over the next few months. It was a frightening thought. Rolling onto his back, Naruto gazed up at the sandstone ceiling with a clenched jaw. I hate this, he confessed, knowing Sasuke would understand exactly what he meant. He hated not knowing how their friends back in Gehenna were doing. He hated waking up in a world where everything had gone so horrifically wrong. He hated seeing the broken pieces of his friends that had been left behind by war and violence. The destruction of Lee's eyes, the loss of Kiba's legs, the deaths of Tenten and Hinata and Sai and all the rest, he hated it all. And most of all, Naruto hated the way that he no longer understood anyone around him. He was surrounded by familiar strangers in what had become a land foreign to his memories. Nothing and no one were the way he remembered them, and the longer he looked, the more the rose tint faded from his eyes. What exactly had he missed so desperately? A quiet jolt of sorcery sent warmth back into her cool mug of hot chocolate, and with a quiet sip Ravel considered Naruto's swaggering steps. Or rather, she considered the self-confident gait Rias made as she moved her nephew's body back and forth across the lounge. Try and make it just a touch less effusive, and I think you'll have it. Try to frown a bit less, Akino chimed in, shifting her teal gaze up briefly before returning to the paper crane she was folding. Just as Rias was settling into Naruto's body, Akino was getting used to Rias. It was an ongoing project, since while they'd been comfortable enough to be seen briefly passing through by the unfamiliar public, there was always the possibility that those who actually knew Naruto and Rias would pick up on something being wrong. The quest for the perfect facade had turned a bit neurotic, if Ravel was entirely honest. Not that she blamed the others, considering the enormity of the secret they were trying to contain. One mistake could lead to their collective ruin. Smoothing the muscles of her brow, Rias quirked the edge of Naruto's mouth up in a lopsided grin and winked at Ravel. Better? Better. Giving a tired sigh of relief, Rias flopped down in a faded green armchair and slung her knees over the side in a lazy gesture that was more like the boy she was pretending to be than her true self. I hope we're ready for this, she muttered, knuckling at the bridge of her nose. In just a few short hours they'd be meeting her parents for an informal supper, and they'd finally find out if all their practicing could hold up the ruse. A sudden knock at the door startled the three young women into watchful stillness, drawing their stares to the dark double doors. Rias and Akino traded looks before the Thunder Priestess grimaced and mimicked Rias' cultured tones. "You may enter." There was no creak from the well-oiled hinges as Yuto cracked open the door and poked his head in. Rather than offer words, the blonde knight just gave a strained smile before shoving the door fully open to lead Ophis in. Kaneko dogged at the Uroboros dragon's heels, amber orbs drilling into the back of the Gothic Lolita's head. Her semi-hostile vigilance was a visible expression of the inner feelings of both peerages, who reluctantly accepted that the goddess was part of their life now, knowing there was little they could really do but accommodate Ophis' whims. Without Ophis, they had no chance of getting Naruto or Sasuke back. But that didn't mean that dealing with her dictates and lack of regard didn't rankle. "What can we do for you?" Rias greeted, skipping over the pleasantries she knew Ophis didn't really care about. Ophis' expression remained placid as she considered the two young women. "You are taking advantage of the artifacts I created for you. Do not use them for longer than 6 hours at a time. Your life force is being drained to sustain the possession, and your true bodies may expire if you exceed that limit." The look Yuto gave her was utterly horrified, but Rias brushed it off, just like she brushed off the sudden chill of fear in her gut. They'd never used the crystals for longer than 4 hours at a time, so it wasn't like she had come near to accidentally killing herself. "Thank you for the warning, but I doubt giving it is why you came here today." Indeed. Letting her focus drift idly from one face to the next, Ophis finally settled on squarely meeting Valerie's timid crimson eyes. "While they are in the other world, Uzumaki Naruto and Uchiha Sasuke have no method of independently contacting me, and I have no desire to constantly observe them. Their chakra would be unable to interface with any relics I gave them. Therefore, I will transport 2 of you to that world and give you the ability to call on me." Ravel's first instinct was to volunteer herself, but she only got as far as setting her mug of cocoa to the side before her rational side reasserted itself. She doubted that Ophis was going to be a daily fairy, so whoever was brought dimension hopping would be in for the long haul. Rias couldn't go because she had to pretend to be Naruto, Akino couldn't go because she had to pretend to be Rias, and Ravel herself couldn't go because she had a high profile of her own. If the pinched quality Rias gave Naruto's mouth was any indication, the ruined princess had come to the same conclusion as Ravel. "I will go," Kaneko declared neutrally, folding her hands behind her back with all the rigid tension of a trained soldier. "Yuto may be needed to act as Rias' escort to social events, and Gaspar is too young to be involved in this." "Very well." Ophis accepted before anyone could raise an objection. "And the other?" "What do you mean, other?" Rias questioned sharply, the baritone in her borrowed voice rumbling with hints of tense displeasure. "Surely you only need to borrow one of us?" Maybe it was a bit petty of her, but their little family was already strained at the seams. Why did Ophis seem so content to scatter them to the winds? For the first time since she'd entered the room, Ophis' blank facade slid away, with her eyebrows pinching together in irritation and impatience. "Naruto and Sasuke will not necessarily travel together. In fact, based on the babblings of those humans they are currently aligned with, they will make a habit of operating separately. Therefore, it would be more prudent if they each traveled with someone capable of making contract with me. I have no desire to squander the investment I have made in them because of sentiment. Now, who is the other?" Rias clenched her jaw, but subsided into sullen silence when Akino placed a cautionary hand on her shoulder. "It's me." Valerie spoke up, breaking the tense stillness with an unusual steel note to her voice. Even her slitted red eyes had shifted from quiet anxiety to a gentle sort of determination. "There's no one else who can go, unless we tell other people about Naruto's secret. Which I'm not going to do, and which I'm not going to let anyone else here do. So, it has to be me." "Yeah." Ravel sighed to herself, ducking her head down and picking at the edge of her fingernail to hide her discontented expression. "It does." Naruto wrinkled his nose at the smell of horseflesh, pulling his casa down to better cover his eyes and absently chewing the stalk of wheat he'd plucked from the roadside. They might still be in southern marches of High no Kuni patrolled by Konohanin, but the demarcation line was rolling closer with every second and his disguise needed to hold up until the last possible moment. "I don't suppose you've got a bit more of that jerky?" Naruto prodded the driver as he leaned back against the straw-filled cart, rubbing a hand over his rumbling belly, and wishing they'd been given rations of ramen rather than dried beef. "I'm starving." A thick-set brown mustache twitched as the driver, whose name Naruto really couldn't remember, glared out of the corner of his verdant eyes. "No," the Sunanin intoned deeply, looking like he was swallowing down a barrage of prickly curses. The obvious frustration was almost enough to make Naruto feel sorry for the guy. Almost. The driver was just too much of a prick for Naruto to feel real contrition. All right, fine." The Jinchuriki moaned lowly, rubbing a knuckle into the thick smeared makeup that hid his birthmarks. "There's no need to get your panties in a bunch over it." Humph. Rolling his eyes at the dismissal, Naruto let his focus drift back out over the grassy countryside. The warm sun beaming down over the enormous prairie was nostalgic. How many dozens of times had he seen a similar landscape when he'd gone to visit Gaara for a while all those years ago? The sight made him feel just a little bit closer to home, as opposed to the creeping alienation he'd experienced living underground in Suna. "Do you think they're already there?" the blonde questioned vaguely to break the silence. Them being Sasuke's group and there being the point of invasion. The final plan had first contact expected for high noon, rather than in the middle of the night like a cliché, and Naruto's own caravan was right on schedule. But was Sasuke on time, or had the Uchiha been delayed? Maybe Sasuke's status as a literal zombie made him push on faster than Naruto's convo. It wasn't that Naruto was worried about Sasuke per se, but he still liked to know what was going on. Especially now that he'd come back to find half his friends dead, or crippled simply because he wasn't around to watch over them. "No. There's no reason to expect them to be, and our friends are a pretty punctual sort. They wouldn't have pushed through the night and risked a lame horse." The reply was absent and meandering, which was exactly the sort of response any watching Kumonin might expect out of a real civilian farmer. Or from two ninja in disguise with another 6 hidden in the hay behind them, pretending to be nothing more than a pair of rubes. The blast of flame and fury was as sudden as a thunderbolt, slamming into the side of the cart and making it explode into a conflagration of wood chips, grass seed, and swollen embers. "Contact left!" was shouted in the vicinity of Naruto's feet, and with a slow sigh he realized that he'd been blown off to lay spread-eagled in the ditch. Rolling languidly to his feet, Naruto dusted the soot from his green tunic. "And this is why you should let me use Sage Mode, ya idiots," he mumbled, cracking his neck and wiping a bit of soot from his cheek before finally turning to consider the battlefield. Streaks of dark brown flitted over the grasslands to the north, as a squad of IWA shinobi dodged his team's attempts to return fire. The air was full of ash and the coppery scent of blood, and Naruto knew that one of the men placed under his command had died in the first strike. He spared an absent thought of regret for the loss before putting it out of his mind. The surprise had whittled things down to 10 on 7, not counting Naruto himself. Evidently, their disguise had been less perfect than they'd hoped, but better than they'd feared. A squad of 10 is what Kumo might send to be part of a routine border skirmish. It wasn't nearly enough to fight off a sustained invasion, especially when the attacking team had a Jinchuriki at their backs. Naruto gave his shoulders a final roll to work out the kinks, and then opened himself up to Kurama. The sensation of red demonic chakra seething into his system hit the blonde like a drug, shrinking his slitted pupils to pinpricks, and making his heart thunder in his chest. It was only a fraction of the power Kurama could give him, but the burn was so nostalgic and invigorating that Naruto found himself giving an involuntary feral grin. It had been too long since he'd been in true open battle like he'd been born for, and even though he could kick the ass of every shinobi on the field with one arm tied behind his back, Naruto wanted to give himself over to the joy of battle. A few back alley fights in Asmarin had nothing on real ninja combat. Rocketing forward like an arrow launched from a bowstring, Naruto barreled right past his startled allies and picked out his first target. A green-eyed blonde-haired IWA jounin swiftly found himself with a knee to the face, knocking him out instantly and leaving Naruto profoundly unsatisfied. "Oh, come on, is that all you guys have?" he complained, turning on the spot to face a shocked red-haired woman. "I'll even give you the first shot," Naruto offered, letting his arms flop lazily to his sides. "Make it count." The combination of nonchalance and implied mockery was enough to push the woman from surprise to anger, and with a heavy surge of chakra she formed 3 one-handed seals. A thick spray of lava burst from her mouth, glowing bright orange and setting the grassland aflame in a dozen places as the torrent arced towards her target. Naruto blinked and hopped to the side, clearing several yards in a single bound and quirking an eyebrow as the continuous stream of magma followed. "You wouldn't happen to be related to the old Mizukage, would ya?" he wondered aloud, not bothering to wait for an answer, as he ducked low and lunged. The smack of his fist on the tender flesh of the redhead's stomach was loud enough to be heard over the clash of combat surrounding them, and Naruto winced as she collapsed bonelessly over his arm. He'd been trying to scale back the power in his strike, but it was still a one-hit knockout. 20 years in Gehenna hadn't done anything for his control, and he'd forgotten just how much stronger he was than the common shinobi. "They're all weak," Kurama rumbled, irritated at his host's antics. The Biju's disapproval prompted a scowl from his host. "So I'll just go after them like they're made of wet paper," Naruto shot back, quickly engaging a ponytailed brunette. This time his punch was only enough to knock the man back, rather than disable his opponent completely. And why does it bother you so much anyway? It's a waste of our time. Naruto disagreed, but he knew that Kurama would never agree with him on this, so there was no point in arguing over it. The fox only found joy in overcoming strong opponents, or in mercilessly crushing weak challengers. The thought of trying to meet someone on the field of combat with equal strength simply to feel the joy of pitting skill against skill held no appeal to Kurama. Blocking an overhead axe kick with his forearms, Naruto decided Kurama's boredom didn't matter in the long run anyway. Soon enough the real invasion would begin, and he'd be expected to overwhelm the opposition as Konoha's secret superweapon, which would satisfy the fox's preferences. But until then Naruto wanted to at least enjoy himself. As a devil, Naruto had trained himself to fight with sword and sorcery, relying on the refined training demanded of a scion of the Gremory clan. Here and now, in his old body, he could return to his roots as a brawler and finally let himself go. Bring it on! Blood splattered in thick dark droplets as Sasuke clenched his fist, the translucent fingers of his Susanoo mimicking the motion and crushing the last of the Kumo shinobi into wet paste. Little chunks of gore dripped through the spaces between the ghostly warrior's knuckles, landing on the broken ground with wet plops. Keep moving. The Uchiha ordered his handlers, letting their horrified gazes slide off his back like water. He had never been the sort of person overly concerned with what the faceless masses thought of him anyway, and with the thrill of victory humming in his undead chest, Sasuke gave even less of a damn than usual. It had been too long since Sasuke had experienced the feeling of utterly dominating his enemies. In Gehenna he was an ant scurrying underfoot trying to avoid the predations of giants. But here, in the world he had been born in, Sasuke was strong. He was stronger than anyone else in the world except Naruto, and even that was questionable given that an Edo Tensei construct never tired and felt no pain. So what if Gaara's little stooges were losing their lunches? Their opinions meant less than nothing to him next to the feeling of violent fulfillment. He wondered if Naruto, who had been born and bred for war just as Sasuke himself was, also shared the uplifting sensation of triumph that now bloomed in his. Letting the last vestiges of his Susanoo fade away, Sasuke eyed the coral tint that slowly stained the horizon. Dusk was drawing near. With the undead Uchiha spearheading their offense, the Southern Alliance had crushed half a dozen outposts since they'd started fighting just after high noon. If they pushed on through the night at a similar pace, they'd be in spitting distance of Konoha itself, but it was probably better to cut their speed in half. The armies following his invasion force could only invest and fortify so quickly, and while Sasuke didn't need to eat, he'd rather not have his handlers die because the defenders cut their supply lines. It was better to take the time to do things right, a lesson he'd learned hard in his first life. Turning away from the shattered battlefield, Sasuke gave Shino a sharp nod and launched into a tireless sprint. A handful of curses met his ears as the living shinobi scrambled to follow in his wake, but Sasuke didn't bother to look back. They had orders to follow him, and since he'd done all the fighting there was no reason for them to be too fatigued to keep up. I would suggest. I know. Half march. Sasuke ruthlessly cut off Shino's puffed words once the Aburame had managed to draw level with him. He already knew what the best course of action was and didn't have the patience to have strategy baby-fed to him by his old classmate. Naruto would have scolded him for being rude, but Sasuke had no attachment to most of the people he'd left behind. 20 years apart had dulled his sentiment to the point that it was no skin off his back if the Aburame got all pissy about being shrugged off. All the people he cared about now lived in Gehenna. Sasuke only cared about Konoha in abstract terms, because he didn't want to admit that everything he fought for had been for nothing. If their sacrifices in the name of peace for Konoha had turned out to be pointless, who was to say any sacrifices they made for the sake of Gehenna wouldn't be similarly pointless? No. Sasuke viscerally refused to accept that possibility. They would have peace by any means necessary. The stub of his left arm throbbed with phantom pain, but he bore it stoically and signed the last of his paperwork off with a flourish. For 20 years he'd lived with the pain, rejecting the well-meant suggestions of his subordinates to get some kind of prosthetic. The Yondaime Reikage always scoffed that looking for a replacement for the left arm Uchiha Sasuke had cut off was an affront to his pride. The idea of grafting on one of those Zetsu limbs was repulsive, and beyond that he'd just end up looking like a warrior ashamed of his scars. But beneath the pride was a sense of shame, the feeling that even if he could that he didn't deserve to walk around hardy and healthy. I had chosen war over peace for the sake of his people's continued survival, soaking his hands in blood and turning his back on the supposed child of the prophecy. A bit of phantom pain and a few ugly scars in exchange for the lives lost and the dreams abandoned was a cheap payment. Ah, if only the Uzumaki boy had lived! Naruto had an earnest, innocent, and exuberant charisma that appealed to everyone from brats in their cradles to hidebound war veterans like Inoki. With Naruto as their spokesman, maybe the shinobi could have weathered the economic depression together and found a new destiny. The future Naruto had promised had been so bright it was like a spiritual fantasy, ringing down from some distant heaven. Maybe though, even with Naruto on their side, fantasy was all peace could ever be. Shinobi weren't warriors, they were liars, killers, and thieves, and if they stopped being paid to do those things, then what was left? How could they put food on the table when no one hired them to wage war? There had been some talk of adapting jutsu to the various civilian industries, but that kind of development took time. Time no one had when the people were marching in the streets looking for someone to fill their hollow stomachs. If Kumo hadn't gone to war against Konoha, it would have eventually gone to war with itself, which was even more unthinkable. Reikage-sama? What? A barked irritably, slapping his meaty palm on the desk and glaring at his sheepish secretary. What do you want, girl? Long used to the Reikage's moods, his secretary didn't quail or stutter at the first sign of his displeasure. Instead, she simply pouted a bit before stepping fully into his office and laying a thick folder down in front of him. This is the latest batch from the Tsuchikage. The Cold War with San might go on forever, but she's pitching a few ideas about how to solve the economic problems without a Kumo-Iwa war if we do conquer them. Fine. I grumbled, waving her off and eyeing the papers with half-hearted interest. Everyone with any political sense knew that it was in the best interest of all the shinobi nations to prolong the conflict rather than have a definite victor. Promoting eventual victory for the sake of patriotism or imagined slights was simply about appealing to the masses. A could have destroyed the Southern Alliance years ago if he wanted a purely military victory. Allowing the enemy to exist was necessary for the survival of the shinobi system, because enemies meant competition. When some chubby merchant decided to get one over on his rivals by hiring a Kumo's shinobi to assassinate them, his rivals fought back by hiring Konoha's shinobi. Obviously no village would pit its own soldiers against each other in death matches as a matter of course. The decline of the Bloody Mist was all the proof anyone needed of that. Naruto's peace had made them function as one decentralized village, turning away conflicting missions for the sake of avoiding bloodshed, which meant a lot of shinobi had been forced out of work. They needed the pay that came with competing missions to flourish, and thus they needed war. So Kuratsuchi's little peace proposals could be one of two things. Either she was naive enough to believe that the shinobi lifestyle could ever lead to peace, or she was just putting on a show of seeking a new path for the sake of her advisors and political opponents. I personally was never quite sure what that girl honestly wanted. She played her cards too close to her chest. It made him miss Inoki, stubborn old fossil the man had been. At least they had understood him, fellow men of war that they'd been. Tatsuka Ken rubbed at one crusty brown eye, fighting back the urge to yawn. He hated night shifts, almost as much as he hated getting posted in Konoha at all. It was too hot, too humid, and too hostile. The natives glared at him like he personally murdered their babies every time he walked down the streets. Compared to the clean, cool air of Kumo and the warm faces of his countrymen, Konoha was a shithole. Not to mention Ken had left his fiancée behind when his bosses had deployed his team down to the south. Eri was the prettiest girl he'd ever seen, with her warm green eyes and fingers calloused from good honest farming. Sure, she wasn't a supermodel, but she was more real than any of the bimbos he'd seen in the magazine ads, and Ken loved her. Once he finished his current rotation, he'd have saved up enough money for them to get married and start a new life. Maybe he'd retire and work on a farm himself? Shinobi work paid a lot better, but he wanted to die in his sleep at the age of 100 years rather than die with a kunai in the throat at half that. Still mooning over your girl? A voice barked in his ear as a heavy arm was slung over his shoulder. Yakumo mussed up his best friend's hair, grinning when Ken squawked and tried to shove him off. Look bro, I get that you want to keep it all on the up and up, but a man's got needs. No one's gonna rat you out if you go take a tumble. You're missing out. Not to mention the girls down at the Maiden are just. He kissed the tips of his fingers. A cherry red flush lit Ken's cheeks, and he pulled away from the older shinobi with a glare. No way. I'm not a dirty perv like you. You're just saying that because you're still a virgin. Yakumo crowed. I am not. Bringing his fists to his chest, Yakumo flapped his bent arms like wings and clucked like a chicken. What was that, Virgin Quinn? I couldn't hear you over all the chirping. Bluck, bluck, bluckhack. Fuck off. Their antics drew the attention of a couple of their fellow watchmen, who joined in on ribbing Ken with gusto. Their good-natured teasing ate up the time and might have carried on longer if not for the sudden flicker of flame that appeared on the southern horizon. The hell is that? Yakumo muttered, squinting at the small but growing light. Did some decide to get their breakfast in right before dawn and start a forest fire? Ken sighed, brushing off his sleeves and standing tall now that his friend had been distracted. Might be. The Chunin agreed easily, sparing a glance for the slowly spreading fire. Wouldn't be the first time these ash-eaters forgot how to cook like civilized people. Do you want to send the message or do you want me to? Screwing his face into an expression of distaste, Yakumo turned, shook his head, and shoved at Ken's shoulder. No chance. You can deal with the captain this time. Sage knows he'll be passed out drunk in some wrinkled whore's tits again, and it's not my turn to listen to his rants about proper respect. A rather large part of Ken wanted to just roll his eyes and try to bribe Yakumo into doing it again. Everyone hated Iwari Taicho and the captain hated them right back. It was mystery how someone so disliked by the men ended up in charge of them. Most people put their bets in bribery or blackmail. Ken personally thought Iwari had used family connections to leapfrog his way up the chain of command. But the larger part of Ken nagged at him to be fair. Everyone took their turns putting up with the captain for the sanity of the whole unit. So when his term came around, he really should do his part. Fine. Just don't expect me to badger him about your vacation request. That's on you. Yakumo grinned toothily, but whatever reply he offered was drowned out by a sudden rush of sound as the trees below the walls of Konoha suddenly exploded with a sun-bright flash of brilliant orange. 20 years out of the saddle left Naruto feeling a bit winded, perfectly resurrected body or not. But that little bit of fatigue burned away in an instant when he cleared Konoha's walls in Kurama mode, only to find that the faces of the Hokage monument had been smoothed away, leaving a featureless gray expanse. At the point, the only thing left was a red-hot ball of pure rage boiling in his gut. Slitted orange eyes narrowed as Naruto forced his gaze away from the empty space where his father's face should have been to the foreign tower crowned with a Kumogakyo flag. Bastards! He rumbled, lurching forward. Rock and wood crumbled beneath the toes of Kurama's fluid body as the giant chakra monster stomped up the streets, roaring so loud hundreds of windows shattered. Maybe he should be a bit more careful about the collateral damage, but the deeper he moved into Konoha the more Naruto found his anger building. It wasn't just the Hokage monument that had been scored away. He could see the distant grove where the memorial stone should have been, but instead the entire forest had been cleared away for a cluster of condos. The rounded red tiles roofs of his childhood had been almost entirely replaced by square shining metal panels. The invaders hadn't just conquered Konoha, they'd destroyed it and remade it in their own image. There was nothing left of the home he had such precious memories of. Easy, kid. Kurama cautioned. Buildings are just buildings. Blow them up and rebuild them later if you want. Don't lose your head. Swallowing thickly, Naruto clenched his fists before relaxing with a sigh. Yeah, I guess. He allowed, trying to throw off the fury and focus on his mission. He couldn't get too attached to material things. The conquest might have turned Konoha into an eyesore, but if he couldn't forgive that, how could he ask people to forgive the lives that had been lost? Fireballs and bolts of lightning rippled over the flank of Naruto's summoned chakra construct, sucking at his reserves like tiny little mosquitoes. They wouldn't be a threat for another few hours, but if he just sat around eventually he'd tire out. Time to take care of business. Mentally stepping back a bit, Naruto let Kurama's consciousness come to the fore. As he gave up bits of control over his own body, the flaming orange fluid of his bijou transformation began to turn solid. If they switched entirely, the liquid chakra would be replaced by flesh and bone, but they didn't need to go that far. They just needed to go far enough for Kurama to be able to speak. Surrender now, mortals, or I'll slaughter you all. Kurama's voice projected over the village like a sonic blast, making Naruto snort in amusement even as the seemingly wild bijou made threats. Then, just to prove he could, Naruto swirled up a tailed beast bomb and fired it directly up into the sky. A couple of heartbeats later the ball of chakra exploded, splitting the clouds with a nova of pure white flame. It was large enough to blot out the rising sun, and the rush of wind it generated rose to a ghostly wail. You want another one, bitches? Are you trying to be a yakuza or something? Naruto muttered, glaring down when the volleys of elemental jutsu launched at them only increased. Because it's not all that scary. Just corny, yeah? Have to give these S points for being brave though. I'd have thought they'd be pissing themselves running home to mommy by now. Bite me. Kurama sulked, giving up all control to Naruto. You're on your own then. Shaking his head at the temperamental bijou, Naruto clicked his tongue before lashing out with one of his tails. The orange appendage wrapped around the nearest watchtower and began to squeeze, painfully slow enough to give the enemy soldiers inside time to escape. He wasn't afraid to kill when he had to, but they weren't at that point. Not yet anyway. How much longer are the rest of them going to be? The blonde wondered aloud as he sought out a tower flying an IWA flag and barreled right through it, bricks and mortar shattering beneath the weight of Kurama's body. Naruto had gotten a bit excited when he caught sight of Konoha, but he hadn't run that far ahead of the troops. They should have showed up by now and started pushing for a surrender. Then blue flame collided with Naruto's construct, throwing the giant orange fox off its feet and into the face of the former Hokage monument. Shock gave way to resolve as Naruto climbed back out, wincing at the crack of granite that echoed as an entire sheet of rock fell from the ridge and hit the ground far below in a shower of dust and fragmented stone. "We should have known," he murmured, more to keep Kurama calm as the fox swiftly shifted from surprise to an all-consuming hatred. "I'm sorry. These fucking humans are all the same." Naruto thinned his lips, but ultimately didn't deny that. He didn't have time to get in an argument with Kurama over the idea of collective guilt. Not with the giant azure hellcat glaring them down. In the end, it shouldn't have been a surprise. They'd chosen war over peace, so why not create more Jinchuriki? "Let's do this." Then he launched forward like a missile, chakra burning with hostile intent. White splinters of bone poked up grotesquely through tanned skin, with porous marrow glistening wetly under the sunlight. A single bit of flying rubble had been enough to completely crush Ken's limb, torn arteries pumping out precious blood with every stuttering heartbeat. I'm sorry, but I have to do it." Ken's wail of utter despair spiraled up into an ear-splitting shriek as Yakumo brought his katana down and severed his friend's arm just below the shoulder. "Fucking Sannin," he grit out, blinking through the sting of tears in his eyes as he bent to tie a tourniquet around Ken's bleeding stump. The combination of blood loss and pain was enough to make Ken pass out by the time Yakumo managed to apply enough pressure to keep Ken from bleeding out. It would buy Ken a few minutes while Yakumo tried to find him a medicine, but any longer than that and the shock would probably kill him. Not that Yakumo had much hope for that as he heaved Ken's limp body onto his back and began to move through the rubble of Konoha. How in the hell had Suna managed to get their hands on the Kyuubi? It had vanished years ago when Uzumaki Naruto was assassinated, and it was supposed to take another few decades at least before the beast's chakra gathered enough for it to be reborn. Fuck. He just wanted to finish his shift, sleep through the day, and hit the town for his weekend off. Now he was just trying to stay alive while the fucking Sannin poured in through the broken walls and the new Kyuubi Jinchuriki fought a death match with the Nibi's Jinchuriki right over their heads. A shockwave threw Yakumo to his knees, grating the skin of his shins and making him shout in shock. Biting his lip as he lurched back to his feet and readjusted Ken's dead weight, Yakumo glanced up at the sky and gaped. A set of bright orange fists were grasping hold of an azure forearm the length of a skyscraper, chakra flames of different colors sputtering weakly as the enormous Kyuubi pulled. The sudden jerk was enough to yank the Nibi over before throwing the giant two-tailed hellcat into a cluster of buildings with a thunderous crash and a hurricane gust of wind. "Shit!" Yakumo gasped, crouching against the gale as a storm of dust swept over the village. He held strong for a heartbeat before Ken was torn from his back and swept up into the tempest. "Ken!" Instinctively, Yakumo knew Ken was dead, and with a bitter scream he turned and plunged through the fog in search of some allied unit to give him orders and clarify what the fuck he was supposed to do. He was just a career chunin pushed into border patrol. He wasn't trained to handle a bijou invasion. Another explosion rumbled, and Yakumo stared numbly at the rapidly approaching orange streak falling from the sky. Gods have mercy. Everything went black. In the middle of a fight, it was hard to tell when he ended and Kurama began. Naruto and the fox were so mentally melded that sometimes he felt like he was Kurama, with excitement and rage at the bijou's enslavement pounding through his veins. Naruto rolled, knocking over half a dozen buildings as he gathered his paws beneath him. Then he shuffled, the dark tip of his nose sighting down the Nibi before firing off a swirling Bijudama. Not waiting to see if his missile connected, Naruto struck like a bolt of lightning. Orange fur rippled as the giant fox leapt up and over a cluster of streets to land on the Nibi's back, and Naruto bit down. The azure hellcat gave a hissing wail, bucking frantically and trying to dislodge Naruto's chokehold. Around and around the tangled pair went, rolling through a trio of office buildings before slamming face first into the former Hokage monument. Caught between fire and stone, Naruto spat a curse and bit down hard. His 9 tails wrapped around his opponent's limbs and pulled. The Nibi was strong, but the Kyuubi had 4 times as many tails and more power besides. It only took a few minutes of struggle to force down the other Jinchuriki. "Give it up already." "Never!" A deep and unmistakably male voice roared back, startling the blonde. He'd been expecting Matatabi's new Jinchuriki to be a girl like Yujito. "Now get off, Leaf Eater." With that the Kyumonin began to fight harder, wailing and flailing until the tangled mass of bijou rolled back into the village, leaving a bulldozed wasteland behind them. "What the fuck are you doing?" Naruto shouted, twisting so he could brace his back feet against the broken ground and stop the rampage of destruction. "Are you trying to blow up the entire fucking village?" I would rather destroy this whole village than let Konoha take it back. Where before the younger Jinchuriki had been all venom and passion, his voice fell to grim icy determination. Then the blue flames that made up Matatabi's hide began to shift and burn. Naruto, you need to move. What? He's going to explode and take us all with him. Heat seared against the skin of Naruto's face, burning away spots of skin and leaving red blisters that Kurama's chakra rushed to heal. Damn it, was this kid that proud? There must be thousands of his own allies still fighting, not to mention the civilians and the combined Sandleaf Shinobi. He'd wipe out the whole village because he couldn't deal with losing? Or maybe it wasn't arrogance. Maybe it was fanaticism. The Kyuubi being in the hands of the leaf again would have the cloud and stone pissing themselves. Throwing his own life away and the lives of his comrades might seem like a fair price to pay to get rid of that kind of superweapon. Fuck. Naruto. Die, Uzumaki Naruto. The blonde took a steadying breath against the shock of being addressed by name, clenched his jaw, and made a choice. Sasuke wasn't delusional enough to expect Konoha to look exactly the same. No city could go through a war without rebuilding into something different. But in of all his vague suppositions of how the village might have changed since he'd last seen it, the Uchiha had never imagined it looking like a nuclear wasteland. Black glass stretched as far as his Sharingan eyes could see, breaking into sharp edges and sudden dark gaps that tunneled into the earth. It was an utterly lifeless scene, with not even the Hokage monument spared from the blast. There was a huge crack splitting the plateau down the portion where the Yandame's head had once been. What the hell did Naruto do? Waving off his so-called allies, Sasuke stepped out into the apocalyptic landscape. Ash puffed under his heels as he wandered over the ebony hills, drawn northwest like the needle of a compass. Maybe his state of undeath made him more aware of the bonds tugging at his soul, or maybe his Rinnegan just enhanced his chakra sensing ability. Either way, he knew exactly where to find Naruto. When he finally settled his gaze on the blonde, Sasuke exhaled a sharp gust of displeasure. You still alive there, Dobe? He prodded, getting a wordless groan in reply. To put it bluntly, Naruto looked like shit warmed over. The Jinchuriki's sunshine strands had grown to a waist-length tangle, stained with white streaks any toothless granny would be proud of. The whiskered skin of Naruto's face was lined with faint wrinkles. Ropey red scars crisscrossed over the naked flesh of his left arm and chest, while Naruto's right arm was simply gone just below the shoulder. Gritting his teeth so hard that they cracked and healed anew, Sasuke bent down to scoop up his heavily wounded friend. I'd break your skull over my knee for your reckless stupidity, but somehow I don't think the message would sink in. The threat was half-hearted, and when Naruto coughed a fine mist of blood, Sasuke found himself protectively pulling the blonde tighter against his chest. Another person would have been bursting with questions about how Naruto had gotten to be in such a horrific condition, but Sasuke knew the man well enough that he didn't need to ask. Everything could be inferred from sight and his knowledge of Naruto alone. Kumo or IWA had deployed some sort of weapon of mass destruction, and Naruto had tried to be a self-sacrificing fool and contain the blast with his own body. Unfortunately, it hadn't worked all that well, seeing as how real life wasn't like the movies. Turning on his heel, Sasuke began hopping back towards the remnants of the southern walls. The idiot needed medical attention, and when he woke up, Naruto would find his body in a very different state than what he'd left it in. The rapid wounding and healing cycle the blonde went through to survive the explosion had probably aged him 20 years, and there was no telling what other scars had formed internally during the blast. Moron. He muttered lowly, blowing the hair out of his eyes. No doubt he'd have to sit on Naruto to make him stay in bed long enough to heal up from this latest bout of moralism. The Kyuubi gave Naruto a powerful healing factor, but it wasn't perfect. A body could only take so much abuse before giving out, and Naruto wasn't allowed to die before they managed to fix the shitshow they'd come back to. Uchiha Sasuke. Do you care to explain this latest idiocy? A startled blink. You. Naruto woke to red shards of agony threading through every cell of his body. It felt like he'd run an Olympic marathon before fighting a war and then going to sleep underneath an elephant. Every breath was a pained struggle against a suffocating weight, crowned with the sensation of broken glass in his lungs. It felt like it took more effort to open his eyes than he'd had to spend fighting Kaguya. The dimly lit sight of a canvas medical tent greeted him, weather stains dizzily drawing his confused stare before Naruto forced himself to shake off the last dregs of unconsciousness. Hello? He rasped with a note of gravel over pavement. Do you make a habit of being suicidally reckless, Uzumaki Naruto? A gray gaze set in a face wreathed in black hair taking up half of Naruto's view. Because if so, I believe I will have to reconsider your worth as my soldier. Office? At least part of your brain seems to be working. Amber glittered as someone else leaned over the confused Jinchuriki. Though that's not saying much though, considering it's you. In contrast to the cool words, a warm hand briefly touched over the stump of Naruto's right arm. Kaneko? A wordless hum was the only answer the Nikomata gave before she withdrew to let a teary-eyed Valerie monopolize the blonde's attention. How are you feeling? Do you want me to get you a glass of water? Fluff your pillow? Another blanket? Some pain medication? The damper rambled on with concern, visibly rattled even as Ophis snorted and also pulled away. Footsteps pattered away as the two girls slipped out of the tent, leaving Naruto alone with Valerie. Naruto licked his cracked lips with a tongue that felt like sandpaper, coughing faintly before shaking his head. Even that tiny motion felt like his skull was rotating on a rusted spike. Why are you here? How are you here? He demanded, gaze sharpening as his scattered wits turned away from the sheer discomfort he was in to refocus on his bishop. Valerie quirked her mouth up into an awkward grin, crimson eyes shifting away before skittering back to meet Naruto's expectant look. Well, Ophis decided that someone needed to cross over here. She said she didn't know how long you need to be here, and since she couldn't spend all her time watching you, that a couple of us needed to be here to summon her when you and Sasuke were finished. To Naruto's displeasure, the blonde girl was obviously lying. Or perhaps not lying, but she was certainly leaving out some things that he would want to know. I see, and what else is Rias up to? Shrugging lightly, Valerie fisted her hands in her lap while struggling against the urge to look away. She's not doing a whole lot. Mostly she's just been spending her time lying to everyone and pretending that both peerages are on a vacation. Nothing too difficult. The frustration that churned in his chest was foreign. Naruto couldn't remember any time where he'd honestly been frustrated with Valerie. His bishop was easygoing, kind, and more than a little easy on the eyes. She'd never tried to hide anything from him before, and the fact she was trying to now put him on edge. Still, maybe Naruto would have better luck getting whatever it was out of her when he wasn't stuck in a bed. So with the drawn outside, the Jinchuriki dropped it, relaxing back into his pillow and considering Valerie with a half-lidded stare. So, is it just you and Kaneko that came over? Yep. Now that Naruto's hospital bed interrogation was over, Valerie found herself studying the little stump that was left of Naruto's right arm. It horrified the blonde to see her savior so badly hurt, but she comforted herself with the knowledge that once they returned home, Naruto would be back in his whole and healthy devil body. Squirming a bit at Valerie's concerned hangdog expression, Naruto twisted his head and frowned off to the side. It's not that bad, he mumbled. Sure, it had hurt like a motherfucker getting blown off, but it wasn't something he hadn't lived through before. Naruto didn't want anyone's pity. It made him feel weak. Naruto. Cloth rustled as the tent flap drew back and Sasuke stepped inside, the Uchiha's sudden appearance cutting off Valerie's stutter. Finally awake, are you, knucklehead? Bastard. The corner of Sasuke's porcelain mouth curved, grave dirt crackling and reforming at the motion as he passed Naruto a glass of water. So I see you're up to speed on our unique situation. Ophis and I spoke and we decided the smartest thing to do would be to keep the girls out of sight and out of mind, as best we can. None of the grunts are going to question us, but you can be damn sure Sakura will if she finds out about them, and that would add complications. Gleefully gulping down the blessedly cool water, Naruto mulled over the implication that Sakura couldn't be trusted. 20 years ago he'd have answered that kind of suggestion with his fists. Team 7 had seemed so unbreakable back then. But the Sakura he'd seen bits of pieces of since his resurrection was a very different woman. A woman he no longer knew. Besides, was it really any of their business anyway? Kagaya had proven there were different worlds, so it wasn't like they were keeping a huge secret from her. A new life in a new world was basically the same thing as wandering around in the afterlife, functionally anyway. Gehenna and Konoha didn't touch, except for a rare alignment of secret stars, and perhaps they never would again. Yeah? Naruto grimaced, shoving his empty cup back at Sasuke. I'll keep my mouth shut. What other news do you got for me? With the dust washed away from the inside of his mouth and throat, Naruto's mind felt clean and revitalized. Folding his arms behind his back in an idle military posture that Naruto assumed he'd picked up on the front lines in Gehenna, Sasuke began. You were out for 5 days, so by now we expect everyone from here to Yuki no Kuni to have heard that the war is back on, and Konoha is fielding a Kyuubi Jinchuriki. We're hoping they assume it's a new one rather than realize that Sakura pulled us out of the grave. Naruto sent a quick smile towards his bishop, reassuring the blonde girl as she uncertainly made to leave. You don't have to go. Then he returned his focus to Sasuke. No, they probably know it's us. Jiraiya-sensei told me that if I died with the seal intact, Kurama would disperse for 50 years or so. It's only because I'm alive again that his chakra all gathered back together. Kurama said something about his mind, The Nexus, and the seal or whatever. I didn't really get it, but they might. So they're probably going to know. And there was that kid. What kid? Sasuke demanded sharply. The guy they sealed Matatabi into. He called me by name, so he definitely knew it was me. So either Kumo and IWA already know all about Jinchuriki revivals, or Matatabi told him when we were fighting. Naruto didn't want to believe the second one, but he knew it was the more logical option. No one had ever revived a Jinchuriki that hadn't gone through an extraction before dying as far as he knew, so some random kid from Kumo knowing about seal theory that he barely knew about was pretty far-fetched. Matatabi had been his friend, but she still seemed willing enough to lend her power to his opponent, and bring the fight to him. Willing to go to the point of a suicide strike even. Had she really been his friend at all? Maybe she'd just been amused by the little mortal monkey spouting ideals at her. Thinking of the Hellcat brought a very important question to Naruto's mind, and he gave Sasuke a steely look. What about the village? I know after 5 days we've probably got some reinforcements, and a decent base camp set up, but how bad is the damage? Kurama and I tried to contain the blast. Tense silence hung in the air. Sasuke. When we got here the place looked like someone had dropped a nuke. Sasuke hesitated before shaking his head. There were no survivors. Naruto pressed his hand to his leaking eyes. Of course there weren't. And then he began to bitterly laugh. To Kaneko, the entire world Sasuke and Naruto came was wrong. She was so used to the subconscious thrum of chakra moving through reality that coming to a plane without it felt like being wrapped in cotton. Everything was missing just a touch of color, everything was just a little bit muffled, and even the air seemed to be leached clean of rich aromas. But she hadn't been pulled across the void to complain about the lifelessness her destination, so Kaneko kept her mouth shut and her opinions to herself. Now that Naruto's awake, we're going to be moving out. You should get ready for a midnight march. Sasuke huffed quietly as he came up behind the Nikomata, the crunch of the black ash under his feet reaching her ears long before his voice did. Here. Kaneko accepted the purple bandana he shoved at her with a grimace, tying the cloth over her distinctive white hair and settling the hideate over her brow. It had been recently washed, but she could still smell the faint scent of blood, making her suspect Sasuke had scrounged it off someone's corpse. Does it fit? Unsettling red eyes that were ringed with dark scara traced Kaneko from head to toe, studying the makeshift shinobi outfit they'd constructed. While questions would be inevitably asked if she stuck around the Uchiha, suspicion would be delayed if the Dimension Hopper looked like just another soldier under Sasuke's command. It'll do. Fine. Having completed Kaneko's disguise, Sasuke turned away and stared over the ebony wasteland with a desolate expression. A stranger wouldn't have noticed the slight downturn to his lips or the faint crease between his brows, especially with the winding cracks of resurrection marring his skin, but Kaneko saw it clearly enough. Asking him if he was alright seemed like a stupid question, so Kaneko squared her shoulders and settled her amber gaze back on the desert Konoha had become. They'll rebuild it, she declared, making an instinctive attempt at reassurance that she wasn't sure was even wanted. Sasuke's agreement came in a nearly silent murmur that was snatched away by the evening breeze. A heartbeat passed before he gave a louder sigh. But I'm not sure they should. A sort of bleak wistfulness brightened the crimson of his Sharingan. Even if they try, they're not going to be able to get back what they lost. The clinical othering in his miserable words caught Kaneko's attention, and her shoulders drew tight with a mixture of relief and guilt. Them? She dared to question, watching as a dune of ash began to disintegrate in the distance. Not we? The thought that Sasuke might want to stay had crossed her mind from time to time, but she tried not to pay it any heed. No. Sasuke sounded as if he'd aged 10,000 years in a moment, remorse and nostalgia mingling on his tongue until his very breath was heavy with the tone of defeat. I think I knew the moment we woke up here that we didn't belong anymore. Even Naruto is starting to realize that. This place no longer feels like home. And for me, I don't know if it ever did. Valerie drew her cloak tighter around her shoulders, following faithfully at her king's heels like a determined bloodhound as they leapt through the trees. As far as she'd been picked up from the camp gossip before they set out, they were traveling to resupply at an abandoned outpost that had once been owned by a man named Orochimaru before traveling northeast towards the Land of Lightning. Those names meant nothing to Valerie, since she hadn't even bothered to glance at a map before rushing after Naruto. It didn't really matter to her where they were going, as long as she stayed by his side and made sure no one hurt him anymore. To Valerie, the land of shinobi that her king described had always seemed like a fairy tale. There were bold warriors and hateful villains in his stories, but good always beat evil. She knew what Naruto told her was a good-natured fib, but she hadn't thought reality would be so different. She hadn't thought Naruto might almost die, surviving as a cripple that burned through his youth in a single battle. He'd been in so much pain when he woke up, both physical and emotional, that it lit a quiet ember of rage in the blondes. Why did these stupid humans have to turn to Naruto to solve all their problems? Why couldn't they have just worked through whatever greedy squabble they had on their own without involving him? It didn't matter that they thought he was happily in the afterlife rather than happily in another world. They were greedy, short-sighted, and selfish either way. You know, if you think too hard your brain is going to start smoking. Naruto threw a grin over his shoulder at her, mouth pulling up into an attempt at reassurance despite the dark hollows of his cheeks and the corpse-white streaks through his hair. Valerie smiled back, ruby eyes dull with insincerity. I'll try not to. They were pretending at happiness, pretending that nothing had changed despite the pain this world had rewoven into Naruto's heart. Some fanatic shinobi had blown himself up, massacring hundreds of troops and tens of thousands of civilians, but it was Naruto who felt he needed to bear the burden of that bloodshed rather than laying it at Kumo's door where it belonged. The smile on Naruto's lips went brittle, and Valerie knew that he'd seen through her poor lie. But rather than confront her, he merely tipped his head before turning away. It was just more evidence to Valerie that the shinobi world was draining the life out of her king. Birdsong echoed as they ran on through the night, trees hills giving way to wet lowlands and rice paddies. Eventually dawn broke over the eastern horizon, and with a sharp whistle Sasuke urged the whole company to halt. We're here. Valerie grimaced as mud squeezed into the open toes of her shinobi sandals, but she put the minor discomfort out of her mind as she moved to shield Naruto from any prying eyes. Do you need water? She offered, her hooded head bent low. Sure. Naruto accepted her canteen, gulping back a mouthful before passing it back to her. You take the rest. I don't really need it. Rias made sure I was well watered before we came here. The euphemism would fly over the heads of any eavesdroppers, but Naruto knew about her blood hunger already. Drawn as close as they were with the unyielding steel in Naruto's spine, to the rest of the shinobi it would look like Naruto was just having a private conversation with a pretty young woman. But Valerie took note of the gray pallor to her king's face and the faint trembling of his remaining hand, and she worried. In her opinion Naruto needed a few weeks of rest to finish healing, but the blonde had quietly told her before they set off that war waited for no man. Konoha was depending on Naruto, and he wasn't willing to let it down. He was too selfless. If she didn't love him so much for it, Valerie might scream with frustration. Would it kill him to maybe accept that he couldn't solve the whole world's problems? Because it was definitely going to kill him if he tried. There's a few scraps here and there, but it looks like they picked it clean when they swept through here after taking Orochimaru. Sasuke cut in, striding up with an idle hand resting on the hilt of his Chikuto. The Uchiha considered Valerie with his unsettling undead scrutiny for a moment before looking back towards Naruto. Orders came in by Hawk. Sakura wants us to force a march right to the Yushimo border before Kumo does. But it's up to you. Naruto knuckled at his left eye, mouth twisted into a fierce frown. Meaning if I don't feel up to it, we won't, because there's nobody around that can make us do it, yeah? Snorting at the thought, the grayed blonde shook his head. No, I'm not going to drag us down. Tell them that they've got an hour to rest, because after that we're going right to Kaminari no Kuni. I'm not dragging this out any more than I have to. Sasuke hummed noncommittally, a wary expression on his face as he studied Naruto. If you're sure. Then he spun about, stalking back towards the faceless crowd with a stiff back and a silent Kaneko plodding after him. Without the brief distraction Sasuke provided, the two blondes fell into an uneasy silence. You know, Val, you don't have to run around after me. Naruto scratched the bridge of his nose pensively. Things are gonna get pretty violent from here until it's all settled. No one would think less of you if you wanted to hole up someplace until all the fighting's over. I would think less of myself. The damper instantly refused, threading her dainty fingers together, as she latched a deliberate narrow stare on her king's empty sleeve. You're right. I don't like violence. But I'm not a child like Gasper is, so please don't send me away. Valerie wasn't like Ravel or even like Kaneko. If Naruto didn't want her around then she wouldn't force herself on him to ease her own worries. A servant swore to follow the orders they were given, every last one of them, and she didn't want to give Naruto a reason to throw her away. But just because she would obey didn't mean she wanted to. Holding her breath, she waited, and just when the silence seemed unbearable the protective clench to Naruto's jaw relaxed. I suppose I couldn't expect you to do something I wouldn't. Just remember that some of the people we're going against are pretty strong. Strong enough to kill a devil. So be careful, okay? For the first time since she'd stepped into this hellish world, Valerie found her face slipping into a real smile. And maybe it was a reaction to her sincerity, or maybe it was just her imagination, but it seemed like the heavy cloud of despair that had hung around Naruto for the past day was finally lightening. Phantom pain thrummed in the empty space where his right arm had been, but Naruto forced it down as he stepped over the ice-coated grass of Midnight Shimo no Kuni. He had no time to spend drowning in self-pity when a war was riding on his shoulders. Peripherally, Naruto was aware of the tired grumblings of the men that Gaara and Sakura put under his command. The long march was draining even him, and the girls weren't doing much better. Only Sasuke, undead creature that he was, seemed unaffected by the long march and the chill that turned every exhaled breath into white mist. Naruto guessed, based on hazy decades-old memories of the landscape before the Fourth Shinobi World War, that they'd hit the border of Lightning Country just after dawn. After that, it was a gamble to see if A and Killer B would march out to meet them, or if he and Sasuke would need to stomp right into Kumogakure itself. Once they took Kumo out of the war, IWA would probably fold, since the former was much more powerful after managing to get 5 now after the clusterfuck in Konoha, Bijou in its arsenal. That wasn't even mentioning the fact that Kuratsuchi was more flexible than A or Inoki. If he gave her a reason to come to the table and talk it out, Naruto believed she would. Rationally, open war couldn't go on much longer, and Naruto clung to that hope like a drowning man. He never wanted to wake up against with ash on his tongue and the knowledge that he'd failed so miserably. Kurama quietly pointing out that if Naruto had been ruthless enough to go for the kill from the start, he could have prevented it, made the whole thing even worse. That's just the way the world works, Naruto. Not now, Kurama. Just not now, okay? The blonde shot back irritably, the crunch of ice under his heels intensifying as he took out his frustration on the frozen ground. He didn't want to hear Kurama ranting on about how he should just go for the throat the next time he got in a fight. That wasn't his way. And if not now, then when? Humans rule each other through violence. The losers are exploited, enslaved, and killed. That's the way the world works. That's the way it always has, and that's the way it's always going to be. So what, you think I should just start murdering everyone that disagrees with me? That kind of world isn't even worth living in. Orange chakra curled warmly under Naruto's skin, bringing a pink flush of life to the Jinchuriki's cheeks as the Kyuubi prowled through his container's mindscape. You're just like the old man was, Naruto. And I'm going to tell you now, I love that old man, but Indra did get one thing right. Peace is something that can't exist without sacrifice and the power to enforce it. Isn't humanity's constant state of war proof of that? Good intentions aren't enough. If you won't even consider that the world can change, it never will. Naruto hadn't fought so hard against Madara to in the end become him. He wanted to bring life to the beliefs of Jiraiya-sensei, not the beliefs of Kagaya. And what happens with the Reikage refuses to back down? Are you going to force him to the table and try to create peace through understanding again? Are you going to have the strength to kill him if it comes to that? And even then, the fact that you need to resort to violence at all proves the failure of your ideals. Stung by the blunt assertion by someone he thought would have his back, Naruto bit his tongue until it bled and shoved Kurama's mental presence away. The loss of the Bijou's chakra let the cold seep back into his bones, but the iciness was welcome company compared to the sharp burn of anger. But of course, Kurama wasn't willing to let him have the last laugh. One day, either here or in Gehenna, you'll learn, Naruto. The ruthlessness to do what's needed for the cause is a necessary quality in a ruler. Fuck off. What did you say, Do? Nothing. Naruto spat, turning away from Sasuke's inquiring expression as he leapt over the snow-crowned hills with his friends at his side. Explaining the whole stupid little argument with Kurama was pointless. They'd already decided what they were going to do to try and heal the land before going back to Sheol, and Kurama was at best a third party to the future of the shinobi system. The Jinchuriki ignored the niggling suspicion in the back of his mind that if he explained the whole conversation, Sasuke would agree with Kurama. They'd already had a battle over their ideals once, he didn't want to do it again. Death was on the cold, crisp wind. In his mind, he wanted to give it a pleasant scent. Something sweet and flowery with the sugar of heaven, maybe. As age turned the trim lines of his body into weathered muscle and deep wrinkles, Killer Bee found himself speaking less and listening more. His self-made rap had dwindled to nothing, and now days could pass in utter silence without even a word from Gyuki. It sounded lonely, but Killer Bee wouldn't describe it like that. It was more like they made their peace with the inevitable end, so spouting hot air wasn't needed anymore. Killer Bee wordlessly met his brother's gaze through the dark lenses of his sunglasses, and with a final nod to each other, the two warriors of an older era slipped through the gates of Kumogakure. Just like with Gyuki, Killer Bee didn't need to ask what was on his mind. They knew each other too well for things like that. When word had reached Kumogakure that they weren't just facing the Kyuubi, but a resurrected Naruto and Uchiha Sasuke, they'd both known the war was lost. 20 years of struggle and dominance were swept out to sea by the one revelation. 20 years of blood and cruelty on top of earlier decades of blood and cruelty. They'd done it for the sake of the village, without hesitation, but now they were tired. I hope that those kids don't decide to come after us. Killer Bee finally spoke, voice raspy from long disuse as they raced through the darkness. It's not like I ever told them they needed to toe the party line. Bro, ordering them to stay isn't enough. When Kumo had decided to strike first and recapture the bijou, they'd ended up with 5 squalling babies that were promptly dumped in Killer Bee's lap to raise. It hadn't been easy, what with the crying and the pooping and the teenage rebellion, but in the end Killer Bee was proud of them. Proud even when word came that Green D had gone wild and annihilated Konoha, because despite that horror the boy had still been like his own son. They won't. A declared softly, booted feet scraping over gray stones and moss. He didn't offer any other explanation, but Killer Bee didn't need one. He trusted his brother when the man said it had been taken care of. Maybe the kids had been drugged or maybe they were sealed up by Fuinjutsu masters. Either way would be fine as long as they stayed back home. Naruto had risen from the grave to take his pound of flesh from the world that had failed him, so the old men would pay the toll and hope it would wash the slate clean. There was no need for the younger generations to get involved. The past needed to be laid to rest before the future could begin. The golden sunlight blazed as it reflected off the pure white snowbanks, making Valerie wince and shield herself against the glare. The damp-returned devil wasn't going to burst into flame at the sight, but her eyes were still more sensitive than any mortal man's. Some in the church suggested the vampiric sensitivity to the sun was because they were cursed. The vampires themselves just claimed it was part of their evolution as nocturnal hunters. With Sephiroth Grawl constantly whispering in the back of her head, Valerie wondered if there wasn't a little bit of truth to both. "Why are we stopping?" Valerie asked Sasuke, peering up the frost-bound hill as Naruto slowly ascended alone and unaided. Her king had ordered them all to let him go on by himself before starting his trek up the frozen hills. An undead crimson gaze shuddered in exasperation, frustration visibly twisting the Uchiha's face as he stared up after Naruto. A few of his old friends are coming. He wanted to talk to them alone. Despite the annoyance sharpening Sasuke's words, Valerie was pretty sure his anger wasn't directed at her. She'd never really given Sasuke a reason to be upset with her. Ice crunched as Kaneko shoved her way forward, nose wrinkled with distaste as a concealed dip in the terrain brought the snow up to her knees. "You should go," the Nikomata advised, slapping a handful of white powder away from her waist. "Before he sells us all to the circus. It would be counterproductive." Kaneko's roundabout assertion that Sasuke had just as much right to be negotiating as Naruto was one Valerie disagreed with. Valerie didn't dislike the Uchiha, but he wasn't as strong or as determined as her king. But she did understand Kaneko's loyalty. Naruto's voice rose into an indistinct murmur, as the blonde waved his remaining hand at a pair of dark-skinned men that appeared on the mountainous horizon. The man on the left was swaddled up in white and yellow robes, while the one on the right sported sunglasses and a black kimono. The trio watched warily as the Raikage and his brother slowly made their way over to the Jinchuriki, stomping through the snow until they stood tall and unbent before the scarred blonde. The tension was thick enough to be cut with a knife as the entire expeditionary force waited for the slightest sign of hostility from the Kumonin. More than one face burned with unyielding hatred, to the point that Valerie knew most of their so-called comrades were waiting for an excuse to start a fight. Peace wouldn't come easily to those kind of men. One way or another, the rivers would be running red. Chewing anxiously at the inside of her cheek, Valerie turned to Sasuke and repeated the Rook's suggestion. "You really should go up there, even if Naruto wants to talk to them alone." If a fight did break out, she didn't want her king to be caught standing alone right next to a pair of ninja whose strength was supposedly legendary. Sasuke wasn't her king, but he was powerful, especially in this world. Please. They weren't really close enough that she'd feel comfortable making personal requests of him, which was why it surprised Valerie when Sasuke just exhaled irritably and started trudging his way up the frosted hill without a word of argument. She thought he would need a little more begging than that. "I hope you don't try to suggest we go up there too," Kaneko warned coolly, the ochre tint of her eyes piercing as she studied the damper. The implication that she'd have found the proposal utterly moronic was hardly subtle. Without the buffer of the rest of their companions, Valerie was exposed to the brunt of Kaneko's chilly regard, and it made her wilt a bit. "Of course not," the blonde reassured the pale-haired girl, waving away the idea vigorously. "We're just strangers here. Sasuke and Naruto know these people and know how to deal with them. We just need to stay out of the way until it's time to go back home." That just prompted an amused snort from Kaneko. "That's one way to put it. But making Sasuke your negotiator isn't the smartest move." "Excuse me?" Valerie's eyebrows climbed upwards. Sasuke cut the one on the left's arm off and tried to sell the other one off to a homicidal maniac as a human sacrifice. They're not exactly best friends. What? Sakura rubbed her fingers, the mixture of glass and ash that made up the Konoha landscape grinding away against the calluses on her skin. Everything had been reduced to fire and ruin. With Yamato long dead, it would be years if not decades before they could restore the life and greenery to her homeland. The destruction of Konoha was just one more grievance in a long line, reinforcing her resolution. Kumo and IWA could never be forgiven, and their crimes could never be forgotten. One way or another, they'd get their pound of flesh. She wondered if this was how Sasuke felt when Itachi drew the curtain on the Uchiha clan that bloody night so long ago. Rising back to her feet, Sakura brushed the dirt from her faded cheongsam before turning to Shikamaru. How soon will Kiri get involved? She demanded without preamble, stalking back towards the tent city that had been erected by Leaf Neen, eager to reclaim their village. To think that a few hours ago she'd been one of them, still full of hope and energy. Coughing harshly into his fist, Shikamaru spat out a wad of yellow phlegm before shaking his head. If they get involved, don't you mean? They've done pretty well for themselves sitting on the fence. Sakura narrowed her eyes into a poison-green glare. Don't play games with me, Nara. The Hokage had very little tolerance for bullshitting at the best of times, and with the ruins of Konoha surrounding them, she wasn't exactly in a joking mood. Schooling his face into neutrality, Shikamaru shrugged lightly. It depends on a lot of things. If Naruto and Sasuke get stalemated, they'll sit and watch. If those two keep bulldozing their way to Kumo, I'd expect Kiri to declare war on IWA by the end of the week. I wouldn't worry too much about it. We don't need them, and the probability they'd declare war on us is so small it's essentially non-existent. In the end, Sakura couldn't find any points in his assessment to disagree with. It wasn't exactly a secret that the Northern Alliance had been throwing its weight around after the destruction of Konoha, and in doing so they'd alienated a lot of the smaller villages and the only neutral great power left. Supporting the Northern Alliance wasn't in Kiri's best interests. More than one village council was probably sitting at the edges of their seats, drooling as power on the continent was rebalanced. Everyone wanted a piece of the pie, but few were willing to spend the blood and treasure needed to buy it fairly. Kiri wasn't Sakura's real concern anyway. As long as Sasuke and Naruto didn't turn their backs on Konoha, they could take on the rest of the world and win. Which was the rub. You saw them more often than the rest of us put together did before the invasion. Do you think they're determined enough? It wasn't exactly the most subtle of questions, and the fact that Shikamaru just looked at her with his inscrutable dark gaze without answer made Sakura's blood run cold. Once the pair were safely hidden away in the command tent with the rotating remnants of ANBU standing guard outside, Shikamaru scrabbled for a cigarette and lit up. Do you want me to make it pretty for you or just give it to you quick and dirty? Just tell me straight. Sakura muttered, sweeping around the battered table and peering down at the yellow maps that were spread out and marked with troop movements. Don't beat around the bush. After the downfall of Konoha, she wasn't the sort of person to mince words. The death of her country had been the final nail in the coffin of the bubbly little girl she'd once been. Giving Sakura a wry look that clearly implied she was asking for it, Shikamaru tapped an idle finger against the diamond marking the front, pushing into Shimo no Kuni. Sasuke is at any given moment 3 steps away from telling us to fuck off. Maybe he just liked being dead, who knows? But he isn't invested in the war, and if Naruto wasn't here then he wouldn't bother with us. Which was just about what Sakura had expected, to be honest. After the clusterfuck that led up to the Uchiha clan massacre, Sasuke was never going to be the blind patriot Itachi had been. Reluctant protection was the best they could have hoped for from him. It wasn't ideal, but as long as Sasuke didn't end up as Konoha's enemy again, she could work with it. And Naruto? Shikamaru spent much longer digesting that query, even bringing up his hands into his so-called thinking pose as he mulled it over. It's hard to say. He admitted after a long moment passed, the crow's feet around his eyes tightening in thought. We all have personal experience with Naruto's particular brand of doggedness. But? Sakura prodded. But he's different. The Shadowbinder frowned like he'd bitten into a lemon. It's like he's just going through the motions. Like he's doing what he thinks he should do, rather than what he actually wants to do. Maybe death had a greater effect on him than we expected. Sakura grunted her agreement. She'd seen it herself in the handful of times that she'd actually spoken to Naruto since pulling him out of the grave. Her old friend didn't have the same drive he'd once had, which was convenient if it came to sidelining him out after any peace agreement, but less useful on the battlefield. It was almost like when they'd resurrected Naruto they hadn't summoned all of him. Like something had been left behind. That could be a problem. The taste of winter was in Naruto's mouth, but that cold bite was nothing next to the shattered feeling in his chest. It felt like someone had taken a blade to his heart and mangled it until nothing was left but bloody meat and raw sinews. Physically he was fine, but spiritually he was bleeding. The blonde just couldn't understand why they'd turned their backs on him. Sure, rationally, he could see why A and Killer B might feel pressured into breaking their shared dreams. Cynical people gave up too quickly and too easily on what was good and clean in the world. Sasuke had been a prime example of that sort of mentality before Naruto beat it out of him. But coming up with a handful of excuses in the back of his mind while trudging across Fire Country was one thing. Actually coming face to face with his old comrades and seeing the darkness that resignation and pragmatism had carved into their souls was another. All he could cough out with a single broken question. Why? Why did they turn their backs on him? Why did they abandon their shared dreams? Why did they flood the land with blood and slaughter? Why didn't they believe in him anymore? Killer B pursed his lips, brown eyes pensive as they dropped to the ground in shame. Of the two of them, his betrayal hurt Naruto far more. But in the end it was the Raikage, and not Naruto's fellow Jinchuriki, that broke the silence. Because we had to. Naruto almost punched the elderly Kage in the face for that, but they were all distracted by Sasuke's sudden arrival. Raikage. 20 years ago the hostility between Sasuke and Kumogakure's leader would have been thick enough to choke, but it seemed like time and death had reduced them to a watchful neutrality. Killer B, Naruto. A small part of Naruto wanted to demand Sasuke give him a bit of privacy with his old friends, as they'd agreed, but the larger part of him was just glad for the sudden show of silent support. It steadied the jittering shards of his heart into orderly fragments. You didn't have to. Naruto denied, resuming the conversation with Sasuke at his back. We knew it was gonna be hard, but we all knew it was gonna take sacrifices. So just cut the bullshit, alright? The bitter accusation in Naruto's tone made Killer B wilt, but it sparked a touch of defiance in A, and the man stood taller. It wasn't about being hard. We could have worked through something that was hard. It was about being impossible. I fought off 43 assassination attempts before I started questioning if we could actually achieve peace without you. Don't blame us for failing when you couldn't even keep yourself alive to see it through. I threw Naruto's fury right back in his face, stoking an even heavier burn of anger in the Jinchuriki's gullet. It's not like I asked to get my head cut off. He bit out, shoving back the memory of the guilt he'd felt when he realized the comfort of his new life was bought by the suffering in his old one. Easy life in Gehenna or not, it didn't justify all the war and murder. We didn't think you did. Killer B spoke up for the first time, his deep voice absent of the rolling rhyme of his youth. He sounded nothing like a reckless rebel Naruto had once known. But without you everyone lost faith. They didn't see a way to get to that future you promised without you. It was the admission of utter hopelessness that finally took the wind out of Naruto's sails, pouring water on the fire of his rage. That's not an excuse. He sighed, breath misting into the air with his exhale. All you had to do was keep trying. There were always gonna be those people that couldn't let go of hate and revenge. We knew that even when we were fighting Kaguya. It wasn't going to be perfect, but it could have been better than this. This being another generation of hate and violence, with gore running through the cracks of their hearts and vengeance on every tongue. So much suffering, and for what? Pride? Money? Land? There's a difference between a couple of terrorists and civil war, Naruto. I chuckled bitterly, the veins in the hollow of his throat shifting. He'd already been an older man during the Fourth Great Shinobi War, but the wrinkles and liver spots made him seem like a hidebound centenarian. No one was hiring shinobi anymore, and your naive fantasy doesn't put food in the belly. Naruto's lip curled back in disgust. So you figured there was going to be blood either way, and better for it to be everyone else than you. Did you even try to find other things for shinobi to do but kill each other? The white folds of the Raikage's robes rustled as he hooked a thumb in his belt and sneered. And what exactly do you think is a good career choice for a man that's spent his entire life killing for money? Most shinobi just aren't good for anything else. Every word was a tired exercise in pessimism. At some point the thick taste of copper and blood had exploded over Naruto's tongue, but he couldn't pinpoint exactly when he'd bitten into the inside of his cheek. He was too busy trying to knuckle away the pounding headache building in his temples. Just shut up, okay? We'll fix this. Just call for peace and we'll get around the table and hammer something out. I'm not happy, but we can still fix this before it gets even worse. No. The simple denial Killer B offered was unexpected, reigniting the simmering tension into a blazing boil. Silence hung for a moment before Naruto squared his shoulders, his mien shifting from disappointed friend to implacable enemy. What do you mean, no? He questioned, deceptively soft. All the tangled-up hurt and mercy drained out of him, leaving nothing behind but diamond determination. The blonde's phantom limb burned. Did they think that he wasn't strong enough to fight them? Naruto didn't want to hurt anyone, but he was more than willing to kick some ass if he had to. In contrast to Naruto's rising aggression, it seemed like that last dregs of pride fell away from the Kumonin. Neither of them seemed willing to meet his eyes, but eventually Killer Bee pursed his lips and raised his head. "We're tired, Naruto. It's time for a new generation to step up, which ain't gonna happen until we're out of the way. Darui already knows what we want him to do." Disbelief made all the muscles of Naruto's face go slack. What? He struggled to comprehend just what exactly they wanted from him. It just didn't make sense. They couldn't. Surely not. What? "We're tired. Tired but unwilling to surrender. Tired but still searching for that crimson blaze of glory and honor. All it would need was for Naruto to stain his fingers with scarlet sin." Viscerally, he refused. He'd fight if he had to, for the sake of the future. But fighting to satisfy the pride and masochism of his old comrades? What they were asking for made Naruto recoil, his right hand fisting in denial. Perhaps that was the last straw. "Fine then." Sasuke cut in coldly, settling on hand on the hilt of his Chikuto and pinning the two Kumogakure shinobi with his spinning pinwheel gaze. For the first time since his resurrection, the Rinnegan burned in his left eye, and naked steel shone under the dawn sunlight as he drew his blade. "I'll end it for you." There was only a split second between Sasuke's ominous declaration and the sudden rage of blood and thunder that shattered the morning. The Uchiha and the Raikage were racing across the hilltops, clashing steel and lightning even as Killer Bee wreathed himself in red chakra and threw a lariat at Naruto. Caught off guard but still agile enough to make up the difference, Naruto lunged under Killer Bee's arm in a full-body tackle that brought both Jinchuriki down to scrabble in the snow. The blonde's own chakra cloak bubbled up out of his pores and struggled for supremacy while Naruto kneed Killer Bee in the stomach and surged back to his feet. "Damn it, Bee! This isn't a fucking game." "No." Killer Bee nodded once, the red swirl of chakra intensifying around him. "It's not." Then his skin peeled away, the scent of burnt copper and iron thickening in the air as he drew on more and more of Gyuki's power. The time for talking and compromising had passed. It was time for adrenaline and violence. The air echoed with a subsonic boom as Bee stepped forward, ice and rock shattering away from the force of his launch. His heavy fists weaved from side to side, deflected desperately by the frantic motion of Naruto's one remaining hand. "Sir!" A pair of Konoha jounin screamed, blazing up the hill even as Naruto roared at them to get back. They moved with enough speed to make Kakashi jealous, dark steel clenched in their hands as they circled around to come at Killer Bee's flanks. Naruto cursed under his breath, grabbing at Killer Bee's left wrist while bringing his leg up in an attempt to sink his foot into the slightly flabby flesh of Killer Bee's gut. "Get the hell out of here!" Unlike Naruto, the dime a dozen shinobi churned out to fill the ranks were just meat shields when it came to fighting someone like Killer Bee. And it showed when the once rapper pulled back so he could effortlessly spin like a top, reducing both his would-be attackers to mist and mincemeat. At that moment, a tidal wave of rage hit Naruto so strongly his vision went dark. Maybe it was the stress of having had to march for days to meet a couple of friends that had stabbed him in the back. Maybe it was because through death and life in Gehenna and resurrection Naruto had lost a piece of himself. Maybe it was the sea of blood he was already swimming in because of having agreed to fight a war for Konoha. The blonde didn't know. All Naruto knew was that when his senses flooded back and he was wrapped up in the warm golden orange of his Kyuubi chakra mode, heat thrumming in his veins as he backhanded Killer Bee so hard a tooth went flying. "You want to get your ass kicked?" Naruto growled out gutturally, fists forming out of Kurama's liquid chakra and pummeling into his fellow Jinchuriki. "Fine." Soil and snow kicked up as Naruto and Killer Bee collided, all fire and fury as they surrendered to the bloodthirsty instinct in their veins. They were monsters born and bred for war, and it showed as they escalated from trading fists to rampaging along the nearest mountainside in their bijou forms. Naruto slammed a paw against the granite plateau, steadying himself as Kurama's throat rippled and swelled with a bijudama. If Killer Bee wanted a fight, he'd get one. Naruto would break every stubborn bone in his body until the fucking moron was ready to sit down and listen. Flaming orange jaws opened with a crack, and then the air was full of heat and light. There was fire and lightning on the horizon, blazing so bright it drowned out the midday sun, and Kaneko thinned her lips at the sight. "Stay put." It wasn't the first time she'd had to order the fretting Valerie to not get involved in what looked to be a battle of the titans, and Kaneko doubted it would be the last. There seemed to be no lull in the rage of combat, and as the hours dragged on it only grew more intense. Conceptually, she'd had a vague understanding of the strength Naruto and Sasuke had in this world. But to actually see it took Kaneko's breath away. Suddenly it became utterly clear the kind of power the two were able to muster in their original forms. A level of might that was beyond them in Gehenna, Before today, Kaneko hadn't really known what they were giving up. The sheer difference between what her friends could do in Gehenna versus what they could do in their homeland was large enough to give her goosebumps. But they could be getting hurt. Kaneko imagined for a brief second what it would be like to meet up with her mad, murderous sister again and wrap her hands around that pale throat. The idea that anyone else would choke the life out of Kuroka set her teeth on edge. That revenge belonged to her and no one else, which is why she understood what Sasuke and Naruto were feeling. Sometimes, a fight is about more than just winning, the Nikomata stated cryptically, crossing her arms and continuing to watch the clash of elements. A dissatisfied sound rumbled in Valerie's throat, but the blonde let the issue drop for another few minutes. Off to the west, the two young women could see white lightning bolts arcing through the air like some giant mobile Tesla coil. It was a storm come to earth wandering the mountains of Shimo no Kuni, crackling just beyond the edge of mortal hearing. To the north there seemed to be an enormous sea of orange flame, rippling and twisting like a wild thing. More than once Kaneko had heard the shinobi marvel at it like the ignorant apes they were, never having seen the majestic conjurations of their betters before. Suddenly an echoing shriek filled the air, making Kaneko slap her hands over her ears and grimace at the high-pitched howl. What is that? She wondered, knowing that even as she spoke the raging wind stole the words from her mouth. Gold eyes tracked towards the dying sunlight, and then Kaneko forgot to breathe. An enormous pillar of pale light kilometers wide blazed, stretching up towards the heavens like some reborn god trying to regain the skies. It wasn't electricity so much as pure plasma, energy condensed so tightly that it seemed like it was physically tangible. Blood and bone, Valerie whispered as the colossal display of furious supremacy died away, leaving a hole in the clouds so wide that even the two devils couldn't see the far side of it. One battle had ended, and within the hour Kaneko saw Sasuke plodding back towards their group from the western hilltops. Blood coated Sasuke's left arm from his shoulder to his fingertips, dark and congealed in the chilly air. It's done, he muttered when he came into earshot, his eyes still shimmering crimson and violet. He was the very picture of a victorious warlord returning from the battlefield, and it was enough to spark hearty cheers from the ragtag band of Konoha ninja. The cries of joy from the Konoha shinobi were loud enough to deafen Kaneko and make her wince in annoyance, but those irritants were easily dismissed. What wasn't so simply brushed off was the way that Sasuke tore his own arm off at the shoulder, throwing the blood-stained limb away into the snowbanks to disintegrate beneath their collective gazes. It was a gesture of self-destruction that Kaneko didn't know how to deal with. Rias might have resorted to words at that moment, seeing the tense crinkle of Sasuke's undead eyes and drawing out his secrets one by one with her soft cajoling. But Kaneko wasn't Rias, so when she realized that Sasuke wasn't alright, the only thing she could do was saunter closer to his body of grave dirt, pressing shoulder to shoulder as they watched Naruto's struggle in the distance. Will he be much longer? Who knows? Sasuke shot back flippantly, his arm reforming out of ragged strips of paper. It'll end when he wants it to. That sounded almost like a bitter recrimination to her ears, and Kaneko realized that despite the steely way Sasuke dealt with his past, even he wasn't unaffected. To Sasuke, the entire ninja world was the first bitter reality that had born him, shaping every hope and trimming every dream with gore and chakra. To Kaneko it was just an irritating sideshow, pulling her comrades away from Gehenna and demanding undue blood and sacrifice. I hate this, Kaneko confessed, knee-deep in the snow and selfishly wishing that Office had stolen the memories of their past lives from Naruto and Sasuke. They were too far from home, surrounded by strangers and expected to sweat and bleed for the sake of fleeting humans. Sasuke's admission was heavy, as if he spoke to more than the rook alone when he sighed. So do I. The stink of blood was so heavy in the air that Naruto wanted to gag. It was a cloying scent, threading down his throat and choking him until he could think of nothing else. But despite the thick smell of death, the blonde knew that it easily brushed aside. Easily ignored compared to the wet muscle that trapped Naruto's elbow anyway. You fucking, Naruto croaked, his tongue stiff in his mouth as he stared down at a pair of guileless dark eyes. I should have known you'd do something like this. Blood stained Killer Bee's white teeth as he grinned despite the crippling pain in his chest. It's alright, kiddo. It's alright. Considering the way Naruto's Rasengan had torn through him, it was a wonder the dark-skinned man could even speak. Then again, Killer Bee had always been a pretty tough old bastard. Distantly Naruto could taste the mingled blood spatter and tears on his lips, copper and salt threading together. Go easy, he rasped, blinking through the wetness blurring his vision. Just try and go easy. Even now it wasn't too late to live, if Killer Bee was willing to fight through the pain of Bijou rejuvenation. But Naruto knew what an unyielding and terrible resolve looked like, and so he knew that particular hope was smothered in the cradle. A cool palm settled over the blonde's shoulder, squeezing once faintly in reassurance before falling away with sickening finality. The sudden drop of weight on his arm pulled Naruto down to his knees in the snow. Killer Bee went slack, and with a shuddering gasp Naruto knew the man couldn't be hurt anymore. He repeated, trying not to think too hard about the way the gore clung to his skin as he pulled his arm free. It had been so easy to fall back into his old habits. Naruto had practically made it his calling in his first life to beat the sense into people. On some level, even though he'd been feeling off since his rebirth, he'd expected to do the same to Killer Bee. Naruto had never expected the Hachibi's Jinchuriki to drop his guard at the last moment, choosing to take a Rasengan right through the lung and then refusing healing. He never expected that kind of fatalism from the rapper, and he never expected Gyuki to allow it. "I hate this," Naruto whispered, clutching at his graying mane with blood-slicked fingers. "Why is this happening?" "It's time to go back, Naruto." Kurama's usually booming voice had been lowered to a quiet rumble, and silent grief thrummed between them like a live wire. "Get up." With a last heaving sigh, Naruto stumbled to his feet and turned to the south. Every plodding step he took felt like some momentous effort, sorrow and anger sharpening the breath in his lungs to shards of glass. He had no idea what he was supposed to do now. All Naruto could do was keep putting one foot in front of the other, hoping that it might lead him to some place worth being. Some place where it didn't feel like his heart was dying. It wasn't until the sun was setting that Naruto appeared on the northern snowy ridges, his golden hair burning beneath the dusk like a primordial flame. The sight spurred a dozen cheers from the faceless shinobi that made up Konoha's advance force, and Sasuke knew each and every one of them was ignorant. They only saw the victory that the Jinchuriki bore, not recognizing the devastation or bitterness twisting Naruto's face. But Sasuke saw it, and he understood. "We shouldn't have come back," the undead Uchiha confessed to the night air, shifting with a crackle of porcelain and bone. A Naruto that had never encountered the failure of hope was a familiar Naruto that Sasuke knew how to deal with. The new Naruto that had anger and desolation in his eyes was something else entirely. Sparing a sidelong glance towards the tent that Kaneko and Valerie had huddled up in, Sasuke clenched his jaw and moved forward through the snow drifts. It was good that the girls were sheltering from the wind, since he knew his friend needed something the two devils couldn't provide, and there was an instinctive common tongue that existed between those who killed former comrades. "Dobe. Bastard," Naruto greeted stonily, the wrinkles of premature age deepening around his mouth as he pursed his lips. It seemed for a moment as if the Jinchuriki would continue speaking, but after a few silent seconds Naruto just defensively hunched his shoulders and moved to stand next to Sasuke. Words wouldn't come easily that night, with grief and murder so fresh that Naruto could probably still smell the stink. Sasuke certainly could, even though he knew the aroma was only a construct of his fevered mind rather than his unfeeling body. "There's some sake in the stores," he offered, knowing how tempting the oblivion alcohol would provide must be. Sasuke had taken the booze from the ruins of Odogekure on the passage north despite knowing it might be bad for troop discipline, and Sasuke faintly wondered if he'd had some touch of foresight then. Maybe on an instinctive level he'd expected something like today. Naruto hummed lowly in comprehension but made no move to abandon their shared vigil. "I didn't burn him," he muttered, his hand twitching slightly. "I didn't." Snow crunched as Sasuke took a step forward, half turning so that the purple of his Rinnegan gaze glittered under the first rays of moonlight. "I'll do it." Unlike Naruto, he needed no sleep, and a few hours roaming the icy slopes in search of Killer Bee's remains would do him no harm. A funeral pyre was the least he could do for a man that had asked for clemency during his trial all those years ago. After the fiasco of the Fourth Shinobi World War, it had become standard practice to burn all corpses to prevent resurrection. When Sasuke had finally cut down the rakeage after giving the man the battle he wanted, he'd wasted no time cremating a via Amaterasu. The fact that Naruto had forgotten to do it for Killer Bee just showed how off balance his friend was becoming. A brief moment of defiance lit a fire in Naruto's azure stare, bringing back a faint flicker of life before guttering out again. "All right," he sighed throatily, turning away and slinking off in the direction of the supply tent. Morning would eventually come and demand he be awake and aware, but until then Naruto firmly intended to be senselessly drunk. Watching until Naruto disappeared through the tent flaps, Sasuke frowned and began his journey north. The wetness soaking his pants and the howling wind tearing at his hair didn't bother Sasuke, even when he crowned the third ridge and ending up twisting his ankle between two boulders. It was beyond him to feel any kind of physical discomfort, creature of death and forbidden sacrifice that he was. The only pain Sasuke could feel was his own rage and regret whipping at his soul like chains of ice. Rationally, he knew it was a tactically smart move to revive them, but he wished that Sakura hadn't been so determined to win. They didn't belong in this world anymore, and finding themselves still responsible for solving all its problems made him tired on some intrinsic level. It was like they were fighting for a lost cause, maintaining a false victory out of sheer willpower. Peace had come to the land, but only when Naruto and Sasuke were there to enforce it. Without them as the linchpin, everything simply crumbled to dust. Why couldn't the shinobi handle their own issues? Why did it fall to Naruto and him to keep clawing their way back up to the top with chakra and might so that they could force people to stop killing each other for petty reasons? Sasuke knew that the nature of all living beings was conflict, and that logically he couldn't expect anything else from them, but it still weighed on him. Uneasy lies the head that wears the crown. The quote from one of the plays Yudo had been obsessing over a few months back came unbidden to his lips, and Sasuke was struck by a sudden and fierce longing to just go back home. He missed his makeshift family in Gehenna. He missed Akino's perverted teasing. He missed Kaniko's demands that he play another video game with her. He missed his chess matches with Rias, and he missed training with Yuto. He even missed the way Gasper insisted on calling him sir. Sasuke had been born in the world of shinobi, but every day that passed made the sense of alienation in his heart grow deeper. He felt like a stranger in a strange land, looking for hints of familiarity like a man searches for water in a desert. He didn't want to fight for Konoha anymore, and he suspected that after killing people they'd once called comrades, Naruto didn't either. The weight of his sparkling new Hittite seemed to burn across Naruto's forehead, squeezing tight like an inferno brand. For his entire career as a shinobi he'd proudly proclaimed his allegiance to Konoha and his willingness to fight for her, but for some reason it just felt wrong now. As if despite his childhood he really didn't have any business with them anymore. Frowning at his aged face in the mirror, Naruto ran a considering thumb across the swirl engraved in the dull steel. I wonder, he murmured, slipping it off and tossing Sakura's latest gift in the corner of the room where it landed with a clatter. What do you think? Valerie looked up from the purple scarf she was knitting, tilting her head in consideration before giving a soft smile. I think you look perfectly handsome either way, so it's up to you. That was a non-answer if Naruto ever heard one, but he let the vague compliment wash over him anyway. He could use a bit of ego stroking in times like this. Okay, Naruto declared, rubbing at the bridge of his nose awkwardly. I'm just gonna head out now. I don't want to tell you that you have to do anything, but you know. It's alright. Kaniko and I both know that it's best if we stay out of sight in the rooms so that questions aren't asked. You're not going to upset me just by reminding me of it. The damper trailed her sympathetic crimson gaze over the stiff new flak jacket her king had been stuffed into. I'm more worried about you. Averting his eyes, Naruto coughed a few vague excuses into his fist before slipping from the room. Valerie meant well, but he just didn't really want to talk about something like his feelings. He barely understood them himself, feeling like he was drowning a little deeper every day in some ink-dark ocean. How could he even start to put them into words and actually tell someone about them? No. It was best to focus on the concrete and ignore the rest for now. Otherwise he'd just end up curled up in a ball somewhere. Samurai saluted Naruto as he passed through the halls, greeting him as if he were some kind of war hero. It made Naruto curl his lips in a wordless sneer. Maybe he'd ended the war when he killed Killer Bee and forced Kumo and IWA to the negotiation table, but that didn't make him a hero. It just made him someone willing to kill people he called his comrades. Put a smile on your ugly face, or people will assume you don't want to be here, Sasuke advised, slipping out of the dim shadows that lurked behind the huge pillars holding up the roof. Unlike Naruto, the Uchiha didn't seem overly bothered by their sudden summons to a summit in the land of iron. Funny, Naruto would have thought that the bad memories of tearing through the building after Danzo like a psychopath would bother Sasuke a bit more. It certainly made his spine itch, but maybe that had less to do with memories and more to do with their present circumstances. Better here than marching around out there, I suppose, Naruto admitted, forcing his face into a grimace that sort of looked like a smile. Normally he had a bit more skill at playing nice with S, but he was just too damn tired to pretend. And besides, they were all expecting Uzumaki Naruto anyway. Naruto Gremory's noble polish wasn't relevant. Are they in there? A mocking lilt colored Sasuke's voice. Shockingly, you're the first to arrive. But then there's a first time for everything, isn't there? The familiar banter with the only man Naruto would call his brother was enough to soften the sharp edges of his mouth into a more natural smile, and after cursing Sasuke out below his breath, Naruto threw back his shoulders and entered the meeting room. It looked almost identical to the day that Sasuke had assaulted the 5 Kage, with banners proclaiming the 5 so-called great shinobi countries hanging over a semicircle table. The only real difference was that the Mizukage seat was moved to the middle as the most supposedly neutral village, even though in the closing days before the armistice Kiri had launched an all-out attack on a crippled Kumo. Opportunistic bastards. There was no place for Naruto to sit, and he wondered if he was expected to stand around like a gormless while the Kage argued over stupid bullshit. If they didn't want him to sit with them, why was he even here in the first place? Eventually Naruto just gave a huff, deciding to lean against the wall beneath the Konoha banner with folded arms and a scowl. Whatever. Let them come. He could deal with a little bit of lurking in the background if it meant that everything would get sorted out. Tension hung so tightly in the air that Sasuke wondered why it hadn't snapped yet. Everyone in the room was pretending at being casual, but they were doing it so poorly that Sasuke could tell with a lazy glance every single one of them was ready to draw blades and shed blood. It made him nostalgic for his years in Otogekure. Death had never been very far, and no one was to be trusted. I would think it's not a surprise to any of us that at minimum you'll be expected to completely vacate the lands surrounding Konoha, Sakura pointed out mildly, her emerald eyes glittering coldly like shards of ice. We don't care what ridiculous new name you've tried to give it. It belongs to us, and every single one of your colonists will go back where they've come from. The white blonde hairs of Darui's mustache twitched as the new Raikage sighed, settling his elbows on the table and pinning Sakura with a frank look. It's not as simple as ordering them to stop patrolling. We're talking about dozens if not hundreds of families. They're not occupiers. Konoha is their home. Many of them were even born there. They don't know anything else. Unlike Darui had the level head needed for rubbing elbows and playing politics. In purely pragmatic terms, Sasuke supposed it was actually a good thing he'd killed since while the old Raikage had been respected, he'd been too much of a hothead to surrender with any kind of grace. Gaara considered Naruto with an unfathomable gaze before turning to his fellow Kage and frowning. That's an excuse, not a justification for the continued occupation. The shinobi of the leaf have their own traditions and their own culture. Just because a handful of your warriors were born in the ruin of their homeland doesn't mean Konoha belongs to them. Konoha belongs to Konoha, and no one else. Precisely. Chojuro agreed, propping himself up on one elbow as he stared at Darui and Kuratsuchi with a lidded gaze. The Rokudame Mizukage wasn't a staunch Konoha ally by any means, but he no doubt understood the value of a strong and independent leaf to the balance of power. Not to mention that no one sensible wanted to make an enemy out of a village with walking superweapons. Scarlet-tipped nails rasped against the tabletop as Kuratsuchi leaned back, the corner of her mouth quirking up mockingly. Just because the government changes doesn't mean the people have to. Just give everyone a choice about if they want to stay in Konoha or be expelled. It would be a lot more ethical than throwing them out of their homes just because of what their grandfathers did. And have a fifth column inside the gates for the next 50 years? Do you take us for idiots? Sakura pursed her lips. They will all go, and that's our final word on the matter. Unless you want to settle this on the battlefield. Very deliberately, Gaara shifted his stare towards Naruto, holding his mismatched eyes on the aged blonde for a few seconds before looking back at Darui. The naked threat visibly irritated the other Kage, but there was little they could do but concede with a grumble. In the end, all the power in the negotiations was held by the Southerners, since no one could beat Naruto or Sasuke in the field. In the end, the entire discussion seemed to play out that way. Gaara or Sakura would suggest something in a very mild and reasonable tone of voice. Then Kuratsuchi or Darui would disagree, and then Gaara or Sakura would make some veiled reference to Naruto or Sasuke. After that, Kuratsuchi would huff and puff while Darui sighed, and they'd concede. It was vaguely amusing to Sasuke in a schadenfreude sort of way, but Naruto seemed to just get more irritated as time went on. Sasuke watched Naruto move from careful neutrality to disbelief to a burning rage. Bright blue eyes darkened to indigo with a hateful flame, and the faint white scars along Naruto's jawline rippled as the blonde clenched his teeth. Naruto had never been all that great at keeping quiet when he was irritated, and Sasuke knew that sooner or later something was going to give. No. Sakura bit out sharply, all shards of gravel in her throat as she slapped a palm down and glared heatedly as Kuratsuchi. Kusa might have been a buffer state, but it was our buffer state. You won't be getting a single fucking Ryo out of them, much less have any influence on selecting their head jounin. The building tension had slowly stripped away the Raikage's veneer of civility, and he seemed to give up being polite as a lost cause. Instead of polite smile, a venomous sneer twisted Darui's mouth, and he held his hands out in sarcastic supplication. Well, what do you expect us to do? We can't just give you the pre-war order. It was a very different world back then. You barely have the numbers to occupy Konoha. Trying to control all the minor countries is just going to create rebellion and lead to the next world war. Try thinking with your head rather than your guts. We are not thinking with our guts, so to speak. Gaara murmured, Kazekage robes swishing as he leaned forward and pinned Darui with the lavender eye he'd taken from Sasuke's true body. It's only in the long term that we would even need to consider compromising. In the short term, we certainly have the power to control the smaller villages. The naked implication that was they expected to turn Naruto into a guard dog, moving from village to village and striking terror in the people's hearts to uphold their hegemony. And that was the straw that broke the camel's back. The boiling heat in Naruto's eyes froze over, and the blonde strode forward with liquid lethal grace. "That is enough," he declared, his voice deceptively mild in comparison to the frigid pressure of his killing intent bearing down on everyone in the room. Kuratsuchi jerked back in her seat, lips bloodless while Sakura's eyebrows climbed to her hairline. Over the years, Sasuke had become intimately familiar with all the shades of Naruto's anger. In general, Naruto's rage was like a firecracker, all flash and light and gone in an instant. Naruto was quick to burn but quick to forgive. But at a certain point the fire went cold, and all that was left was ice and poison. "I didn't come here to be your trump card, Sakura." Out of everyone in the room, it was Sakura that Naruto would have expected to keep the faith, and the sting of that betrayal had cut him deeply. "I certainly didn't come here to stand around twiddling my thumbs while you morons recreated the Treaty of Versailles." That reference visibly confused most of the people in the room, but Sasuke knew all about the other world, so he knew exactly what Naruto was worried about. After all, what was the point of a peace treaty so lopsided it forced another war? Naruto's missing right arm throbbed with a sharp ache, the phantom pain throbbing in time with his heartbeat. It reminds him of his own life, half torn to shit and gone, but he could still feel the loss like it was freshly bleeding. There was a twisted metaphor in that line of thought somewhere, but Naruto didn't care to pursue it. He'd bowed and scraped and struggled and wept and raged against the world, and he'd gotten nothing to show for it. As far as he was concerned, he was fucking done with keeping his tongue behind his teeth and placing faith in other people. If there was anyone in the world that Naruto would have expected to never turn their backs on him, it was Sakura and Gaara. Sakura had been by his side on Team 7 for years, preserving loyally through fire and blood until they finally birthed peace and brought Sasuke home. Gaara had been his dark mirror, sinking down in hatred until they'd fought, and Naruto brought the redhead back to the light like a diver pulled up pearls from the seabed. Both of them had experienced more than their share of misfortune and bitterness, but he'd had faith in them and they'd had faith in him. Sure, Naruto had expected some haggling and anger, because they were all only human, but he believed in their fundamental goodness, in their understanding and in their loyalty. Instead, they tried to treat Naruto like their personal attack dog, showing him off and making threats because they just wanted to take and take and take without any regard for how it would hurt other people. Fine. If they wanted to turn their backs on him, then Naruto would turn his back on them. Fuck the lot of them. "So this is what's going to happen," Naruto stated serenely, stepping into the middle of the half-circle formed by the table so he could meet their eyes one by one with a slit purple gaze. He never once let up on his raging killing intent, because it was the only way he could release the tangled mess of ice and venom mingling in his chest. "Since you incompetent baboons are incapable of making sensible decisions on your own, I'll make them for you." Naruto drew nobility around him like a cloak, calling on every lesson Surzex and Graphia had given him. He tried to rediscover the boy that had been Uzumaki Naruto, hoping that self-sacrifice and good nature would be enough to heal the world of shinobi. But it hadn't been, and he was starting to think it never could have been. In the corner of his vision, Naruto saw Sasuke's hand drop to rest over the hilt of his Chikudo, and he knew that the Uchiha had his back. "Naruto," Gaara began, perhaps hoping that the right word would be enough to calm the frozen fury flowing in the blonde's veins. Or maybe the redhead had started to realize his mistakes. No one would ever know, because Naruto pinned him with blazing malicious red eyes. "I did not give you permission to speak. Interrupt me again and I'll cut out your tongue." The threat was given in such an airy, reasonable tone that Naruto could have been commenting on the weather if not for the utterly violent spike in his killing intent. "Now here's what I'll do. Since you idiots cannot have separate countries without marching to war and murdering each other for stupid reasons, you won't have them. From now on, everyone living on this continent is going to answer to one government. All decisions will be made by the same governing authority, determined solely by majority vote." Kuratsuchi's mouth dropped open, and Naruto sneered at the sight. "You might want to close your mouth in case something flies in," he suggested in a sarcastic, sugary voice, giving the Kage time to absorb his declaration. Sasuke just looked amused, the bastard. "Secondly, since I obviously can't trust any of you to look after your own people without trying to kill everyone else's, you won't. Sakura will govern from Kiri. Gaara will govern from Iwa. Chojuro will govern from Kumo. Darui can govern Suna. Kuratsuchi will govern from Konoha. Hopefully the knowledge that if you govern someone else's people badly they might do the same to yours keeps you on the straight and narrow. Thirdly, since I know that I couldn't trust any of you to cook lunch on time if I asked, much less work together in good faith, I'll have Sasuke bind you all together with blood seals. If one of you kicks the bucket, you all will. So you had best learn to work together and do your damn jobs right, and you had best handpick successors that can work together to keep everything stable when you all die at the same time. If the 5 Kage had looked baffled before, they were looking positively aghast now. The terms he'd put together were especially harsh considering he was forcing people that hated each other to literally live and die by their alliance. But he was so irritated he didn't give a damn. Naruto had half a mind to say fuck it all, hunt down Kaguya, and let her gobble up all their chakra. Fourth, Gaara here is going to hand that Rinnegan over. We'll find someone to bring Sasuke back with it, and then he'll use it to send the Bijou off to their own private dimension so you morons can't put them in cages anymore. Maybe it was the possibility of having to contend with both a living Naruto and a living Sasuke that sparked green lightning in Sakura's eyes, or maybe she just reached the end of her tether with his biting insults. You can't seriously think we're just going to agree to that, do you? Orange sparks began to flutter in the air as Naruto pulled up his chakra, lurking just a hair away from calling on all of Kurama's power. Yes, you will. Or none of you will be leaving this room alive. In the end, it was all very anticlimactic. Naruto held the Kage down, brushing off the poisonous glares they gave him, while Sasuke took their mingled blood and used it as ink to sear cursed seals into the backs of their necks. Queerly, Sakura kept giving Sasuke outraged looks the entire time. Like she thought that he would be the one to step up and complain about people being made to stop killing each other. But Sasuke had never been in love with the will of fire in the first place, and once Naruto stopped defending it, the only option left to her was to put up and shut up. Part of Naruto was relieved, because while submission was a rational act considering he could destroy them all, and just make the same offer to their successors, he'd been worried they'd fight anyway. Naruto didn't want to actually kill them. Smack them around a bit for their stubborn blindness maybe, but not murder them. Since his rebirth he'd gotten more than enough blood on his hands. The other part of him, the deeper and darker part, was disappointed. Naruto wanted to unleash the beast in his chest that was rattling in its cage. He wanted to break, he wanted to burn. Inhaling the acrid scent of cooked meat and blood, Naruto jerked his chin towards the door in a silent command. It only took a moment for the bruised and aching Kage to file out of the room, their faces twisted into expressions of shared misery. None of them spared a word for him, which was probably for the best. If one of them started complaining again, Naruto was going to start breaking things. Well, that went well. Oh, fuck off. Naruto sighed, pressing his hand to his forehead before turning to face Sasuke. Without having to actually look at Sakura and Gaara, he found his anger slowly draining away and a spring of regret bubbling up inside. Do you think I went too far? Maybe it was a bit childish to want some kind of reassurance, but Naruto knew that Jiraiya would have been disappointed in him. It wasn't that Jiraiya wasn't able to be pragmatic on the battlefield and understand that sometimes fighting was necessary, but proposing a bona fide dictatorship stood against everything his mentor had believed in. Then again, maybe it was time for Naruto to lay that ghost to rest. He'd loved Jiraiya and fought for his godfather's ideals, but that didn't mean that Jiraiya spoke some absolute truth. It didn't mean that Jiraiya couldn't have been wrong. Sasuke was silent for a moment before shrugging one shoulder and clapping a hand to Naruto's back to push the blonde from the meeting room. No. And you do remember that I was the one advocating peace through force in the first place? We gave your method a chance. It's only fair that we try it my way now. A bitter laugh escaped Naruto's throat as the pair of resurrected shinobi moved back through the halls. Well, it looks like you won in the end then. That wry concession made Naruto feel oddly light and unburdened for the first time in weeks. Fucking bastard. It also made Naruto feel unaccountably lost. If hot tears trailed down Naruto's cheeks, Sasuke didn't mention them. The Naruto that came back looked even more brittle than the one who left, and Valerie almost expected his next step to shatter him into 100 shaking shards. It was disconcerting, because even after waking in the ruins of Konoha he'd still managed to hold himself together with sheer willpower. Welcome back. The damper greeted, wincing at the low wounded growl Naruto gave in reply. Sasuke only stayed long enough to give Valerie a considering look, nodding once sharply before ushering Kaneko out of the lounge. The quiet click of the door shutting behind him seemed to echo in the stillness, punctuated by the rattle of Naruto throwing himself into the nearest armchair. Naruto cursed sharply, clenching his fist in red-faced frustration before going limp with a sigh. He didn't make any move to break the silence after that, seemingly content to muse over his rage and despair. The sight tugged at Valerie's heartstrings, and before she could even properly think about it she'd already abandoned her knitting and curled up in the seat nearest to her king. Are you okay? Obviously he wasn't, but Valerie didn't want to make him feel backed into a corner. Naruto's fist clenched so tightly that tiny rivulets of blood began to seep up through the cracks between his fingers. But he didn't speak, instead just choosing to loosen his hand and watch with hazy eyes as the torn open flesh of his palm hissed and steamed with regeneration. It was only when the last of the smoke curled away that he murmured, low and broken, "No." Valerie's king sounded so bewildered and lost that her heart broke all over again for him, and she took his hand between hers without any squeamishness despite the sticky blood slicked between their palms. "Will you tell me about it?" In the end, Naruto's sorrow couldn't be contained, and words spilled from his lips, sharp-edged and coated with pain. "Everything is just twisted and wrong here. It's all fucked up and I don't even know how to begin fixing it. It's like a puzzle with half the pieces missing, except it wasn't me that lost them, just some came in one day and stole them when I wasn't looking." Smiling faintly at the rough metaphor, Valerie ran a soothing thumb across the scarred back of Naruto's hand but stayed silent. Naruto didn't need someone to speak to him, he needed someone to listen to him, and she wondered if he'd ever really had that. She wondered if he'd ever been allowed to ramble his heart out without challenges and interruptions. The mutual silence Naruto and Sasuke had helped, but Valerie knew it wasn't the same as a captive audience. "It's like, fuck, everything used to be so bright and so clear and now it's just a complete shit show. Sure, it wasn't perfect, and sometimes it hurt, but we'd all decided to bury the hatchet and move forward. My friends believed in me, and I believed in them, and we believed in what we were doing. We believed in the future and in people's hearts, and that we weren't trapped by the shadows of the past. But then I died and it apparently went to fucking shit without me." The bags under Naruto's eyes seemed to hang heavier as he stared into the distance, thinning his lips until they turned pale and bloodless. "We wanted a world without violence, you know? It's like, we thought that if people just understood each other we could come to love each other, and that way we could have peace. Real peace, not just everyone being too afraid to fight. I knew that Sakura and Gaara were bitter, but I didn't know they'd given up on everything they believed in. I didn't know I'd given up on everything I believed in." Naruto huffed a vicious chuckle. "You see, it's kind of a fucking joke. There I was, roaming about and telling people that nothing is unforgivable. That everything could be solved with words if you just were willing to try hard enough. But then I got in that room and I told them that they could either put down their swords or I'd kill them all. I'm such a goddamn hypocrite. Jiraiya-sensei would be ashamed of me." Valerie never felt the distance between them as keenly as she did now. Naruto was a man whose hands built and toppled kingdoms while she was just a girl that grew up in a cage. But maybe that gulf didn't have to define them. I don't know much about him, but I can say this. Blind idealism is not a victory march. Bleary blue eyes snapped to stare at her face, bloodshot and almost desperately focused, and it gave Valerie the strength to go on. "I don't know what your godfather would have thought, but there's a difference between a theory and the real world. The real world is messy, it demands compromises and sometimes a realization that the ends can justify the means." Pausing to take a breath, Valerie faintly flushed when she realized that Naruto was staring at her with an utterly enthralled face. He watched her like she was in the process of hanging the moon, and it made the blonde realize this was a make-or-break moment for her king. "So yes, your godfather taught you that love is the key to real peace. But love can only be born with understanding and without conflict. Maybe that kind of peace can only grow under the peace of the sword, because people need to stop fighting long enough to let that love grow." Blood and ashes, she was embarrassed and rambling, but even spouting half-baked philosophy seemed better than letting the queer charge in the air hang around unchallenged. "And even if your godfather disagreed with you, that doesn't mean he was ashamed of you. He loved you. And we'd forgive the people we love pretty much anything." Naruto quirked up the corner of his mouth, and then threw back his head and laughed. He laughed long and hard until his voice went hoarse and gleaming tears crowned his eyelashes. He laughed until Valerie flushed with shame. He laughed until his bishop tried to pull her hands away. Cutting off mid-chortle, Naruto let the hysteria slip away like early morning dew under the sun, leaving only his unsettling focus on the damper. A pair of azure eyes burned like the hottest part of a flame, pale and bright and imbued with some kind of fake glitter. It consumed her to the point Valerie barely noticed when her king gently took her by the chin, prodding at her bottom lip with a calloused thumb. "The sun rises in your eyes," Naruto whispered, the words falling like a last judgment from his mouth. Then he kissed her. "Are we going anywhere in particular or are you just wandering aimlessly?" Sasuke snorted at the sarcastic barb, throwing a vile glare over his shoulder at Kaneko. "I had the thought that maybe we could get some milk and tuna for you." The cool expression on Kaneko's face didn't waver a hair. Instead, she just very deliberately shifted her gimlet gaze towards the tapestries that lined the corridor. The silent insult would have infuriated someone else, but it just made Sasuke smirk with amusement. Cheeky brat. A quiet minute passed as Sasuke waited for the Nikomata to try and dig more information out of him, but eventually he caved with a shrug. I just need to speak to Sakura for a couple of minutes. Kaniko's mouth pursed at that, but she didn't vocalize any disagreement. Which was ideal because even if Sasuke himself didn't particularly want to speak to his former teammate, he had to. Naruto might forget about the minutiae because at heart Naruto was a dreamer. He was a visionary that dealt almost solely with larger concepts. Sasuke was the one that had to handle the nitty-gritty details. Sasuke was the one that had to take Naruto's off-the-cuff expectations and refine them into an actual workable system before the Kages decided to try and pull a fast one on them. Turning the corner, Sasuke settled his Sharingan stare on the pair of Jounin guarding Sakura's room. The malice in his crimson eyes was so potent that both men went pale and stepped out of his way with a stammer. For a moment Sasuke considered warning Kaniko to stay quiet and let him deal with his former comrades, but then thought better of it. She was a clever enough woman to not need that kind of direction. So instead he just squared his shoulders and slammed open the doors with an echoing bang. Evening, Sakura. Dark shadows circled under her venomous verdant gaze, and the pale pallor of the Hokage's skin only made the color even bolder. Sasuke, she allowed, her voice quiet and stately despite her ill appearance. Is there some kind of emergency? Or is it just that you couldn't contain yourself until my husband got back? The perverse implication could have started a scandal if they were anyone else. But no one would believe that a dead man could be controlled by such bizarre lust, and as a leader Sakura's reputation was spotless. So Sasuke just brushed it off with nary a blink before stepping fully into the room and standing with tireless stiffness. I think we should clarify a few things about Naruto's treaty. Sakura's lip curled with disgust that bordered on hatred, but she didn't look surprised. Well, go on then. She prodded, voice thick with rage and a touch of desolated betrayal. Wow me with the mastery of statescraft you attained during those years of being an insane traitor and dead. I'm just on the edge of my seat here. Then, despite the still aching branded seal on her back, the Hokage lounged indolently in her armchair. If Sasuke was still alive, he imagined that his heart would have lurched at that insult. After decades apart and new bonds in an entirely different world, he hadn't thought that Sakura would have had the capacity to hurt him. But having such a blatant reminder of the failure and ruin that was his first life thrown in his face so suddenly made him rock back on his heels. You shut your fucking mouth. Kaniko shot back, her tone level and chilled with the fury of an Arctic thunderstorm. It wasn't a loud declaration by any means, but it was sharp and biting enough to make Sasuke's eyebrows twitch. Kaniko, he warned softly, surprised but warmed by her sudden move to profane poison on his behalf. Even if Sasuke didn't enjoy it, Sakura had a right to her anger, and Kaniko was a stranger in this world. She wasn't aware of the exact circumstance that led them to such a contentious conversation in the first place. Her cursing out Sakura wasn't strictly fair. With a small grumble of protest, Kaniko subsided, Sakura watching the short exchange with hawk-like focus. I didn't know you'd made a new friend, Sasuke. She prodded, cracking an idle knuckle as she tried to peer around the Uchiha's bulk and fully take in the white-haired Nikomata. Any traces of regret and geniality vanished from Sasuke's countenance, the Rinnegan swirling to life in his left eye as he bore down on the Hokage with the promise of blood and steel on his tongue. And you're going to continue to live in ignorance, he declared darkly, though or else passing through the air unspoken. Sakura drew back with a huff, lifting her open palms in a surrender gesture. Fine. Whatever. But what are you here for, Sasuke? The shift from bitter teasing to a brisk business-like candor was swift enough to give whiplash as Sakura realized the Uchiha's store of patience had run out. Grave dirt and porcelain crinkled faintly as Sasuke sighed, the frustrated exhale reminiscent of when he'd actually been alive. Like I said, Naruto's proposal needs a little more detail. We already made sure you and the other Kage couldn't kill each other. But you need to select your successors now, and even a few spares so we can bind them together too. That way there will be peace for at least a couple of generations. The 5 Kage had no idea that Sasuke and Naruto intended to suicide and exit the shinobi world as soon as they got a functioning system in place, but sooner or later they would realize their overseers were gone. Simply binding their lives together wasn't enough when they could just abdicate to their successors and head to the battlefield for suicide missions. All potential leaders needed to be controlled, and since there were only ever a handful of potential Kage in a village at any time, binding all potential successors would actually work. Every village would have to hold back their strongest soldiers out of the knowledge that the death of their enemies would trigger the death of their comrades and the destruction of their military potential. The Kage were war-hardened, but not suicidal enough to weaken their villages to the point that they could be overthrown by the minor countries. For a few heartbeats Sakura seemed fit to explode, a pink flush staining her cheekbones as she took in Sasuke's new ultimatum. Then her shoulders slumped, and she gave a rueful chuckle that was surprisingly good-natured. Well, I guess between the two of you that all angles will get covered, Alright, what else? Backed into a corner and stripped of all her options as she was, Sasuke expected Sakura to become even more spiteful and twisted. Instead, it seemed like the premise of peace by all means had engendered a personal surrender, and for the first time since he'd been resurrected, Sasuke saw hints of the girl he'd once known. To clarify, when Naruto said he expected one government for the continent, he wasn't just talking about shinobi. It extends to the civilian level as well, so you can consider the feudal lords abolished and their countries annexed. It'll be one nation for everyone, shinobi and samurai and civilian alike. I thought that was a given, but go on. Also, about the bijou. Yes, we're going to put them in a new dimension, but we don't expect you to just kill off all the new Jinchuriki. We'll use Edo Tensei on Killer Bee and that crazy Nibi one before extracting the bijou from everyone, including Naruto. They'll all be dead at that point, but I'll still be walking around to make sure that they all get brought back properly with Rinna Tensei. So don't think you can trick us there. I suppose I can admit that I thought about doing that, but you win.